much packed in today, and we are recording this meeting. Hello, my name is Kelly Ostwick, for those who I haven't met yet, and welcome to the second meeting of the Marine Carbon Dioxide Removal Standing Committee. I'm a senior program officer at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in DC, and serving as the staff lead for this activity. So please note, you'll see this meeting was recorded. This is a public meeting, and the recording will be posted on our website in a few days' time. Next slide. So we're all joining from different places today, all over the world, but I do want to acknowledge the land where the National Academy staff are sitting. So we acknowledge that we gather on the traditional land of the Nacotchtank and Piscataway people, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it through the generations. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land, and we thank them for their resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities to their example. Next slide, please. So before we start, we have quick guidance on participating in today's meeting. So the National Academies are committed to the principles of diversity, integrity, civility, and respect in all our activities. And we look to you all to be a partner in this commitment by helping us maintain a professional and cordial environment. We do not tolerate discrimination and don't expect to have that be an issue anyhow. And I would like to ask you, when you introduce yourself for the first time, please say your name and affiliation. Please do mute yourself when you're not talking. Committee members, please use the raise hand feature to ask questions. Everyone else, please use the Slido link, and we'll put the slide up. There it is. Saf will put that in the chat, and we'll put it in the chat throughout the meeting. Next slide. So here's the link to Slido. We had over 200 people registered for the meeting, so we did want to make sure that you all have the opportunity to share comments and ask questions. I will note that we need to prioritize questions from committee members, but we will try to get to a few others, and anything you put in the Slido will become part of our meeting materials and will be shared with the committee. Next slide. So quickly, one last thing before we jump into the content. In case anyone is not familiar with the National Academies, we are non-governmental, nonprofit organizations chartered by the U.S. Congress at the request of President Lincoln. We provide independent, objective advice to inform policy with evidence, spark progress and innovation, and confront challenging issues that benefit society. You can find all sorts of information on our website, and please do reach out if you have any questions about that. And now on to the good stuff. I'll hand it over to our committee chair, Scott Doney, to provide a quick overview of this project.
Thanks, Kelly. So I'm Scott Doney. I'm a professor at the University of Virginia, and I'm chairing this particular standing committee. And so to give you a little bit of background, we did have a report, and the cover is shown here on the right-hand side, that came out in 22-23. On ocean-based carbon dioxide removal, but a lot has happened in this space, both scientifically and from governance perspectives, industrial, technological perspectives over the last several years. And so this new standing committee is a 3-year project to advance the state of knowledge and pull together, synthesize knowledge of what's happened since we released that original report. The initial sponsor is Carbon to Sea Initiative, and the goal is to provide online updates in terms of updated chapters and new chapters, each of which would be peer-reviewed and then available with unique digital object identifiers. And our current goal is to have the first update of updated material released sometime this coming spring, so 2026. Next slide, please, Kelly. So I'm not going to read the statement of tasks, but this is available on the committee's website if you're interested. I think the key elements here is one task that the Academy staff have been working on quite successfully over the last several months is creating a digital version of the 2022 report. So that would be available. and then that's a venue for us to provide updated material as we go along. And then in terms of what are the updates that we've been tasked with considering, the first is a state of the science, technology, and research of marine carbon dioxide removal. The second would be updates on fundamental understanding on research and development needs for specific approaches. And for example, at this meeting, you'll be hearing material on ocean alkalinity enhancement, which is one of the approaches that we're considering for an update. And then also the overarching research and development needs for cross-cutting issues. These are things like social perception and social science aspects, governance, monitoring, reporting, and verification, things that have commonalities across techniques. And then, of course, any additional information that wasn't covered in the earlier report. Next slide, please. So the committee membership is listed here. The committee members and also the National Academy staff. Kelly already introduced herself, and Safa is doing a lot of the back office help for this meeting and also for the committee as a whole. You can read more about bios of these individuals on the committee posted on the committee website. Next slide, please. Oh, thanks, Safa. Excellent. Safa just posted a link to the committee website. And then here's the calendar. So we had our first public meeting in June where we had a discussion with the sponsor about the statement of task. We started up the committee. We developed project strategy and timeline. This is the second meeting in September. So we're going to have parts of this meeting are open. They're for information gathering. So we'll be listening to and asking questions of experts across this space over the next 4 days in this virtual meeting, as well as having some closed committee meetings afterwards. And then the other meetings on the plan are to have right now, they're all closed committee meetings where we'd be working on the products developed from the information we're gathering this week. And then we have a timeline for finalizing the draft products, getting peer review done, responding to the peer review with a public release sometime late next spring, at which point we'd begin into the second cycle of the committee, which would be to address aspects of the initial report, which we didn't get to cover in this first cycle. Next slide, please, Kelly or Safa. And then if you want to keep up or help out with this committee, the best place to monitor would be the committee website. And that's where we'll have, for example, Kelly mentioned that we'll be posting the recordings from these meetings, the recordings from meeting one, for example, any other announcements about upcoming events. There are also opportunities, of course, to participate in peer review, public meetings as they crop up. So if you have any questions or want to provide feedback, Kelly's put her email there, and it's also available through the committee website. So Kelly, I think that's the last slide from me. Oh, the agenda, thanks. So the agenda, I had mentioned this is a 4-day virtual meeting, so afternoon time, East Coast time, and appreciation for people in other time zones who are adapting to this East Coast time zone for the meeting. So we'll start off today with sessions on the ocean's role in climate mitigation, state of monitoring, reporting, and verification for carbon removal, and a snapshot of recent advances in the field of marine carbon dioxide removal. Tomorrow, we'll be talking about state of marine CDR policy and permitting, and also social perceptions. Wednesday, we'll be discussing mesocosm and field trials, and then Thursday, we'll be touching on additional global perspectives on marine carbon dioxide removal. So I want to welcome everyone to this virtual meeting. And Kelly, I think I'll turn it back over to you for our first speaker.
Excellent. Thanks, Scott. So we wanted to kick off this series of meetings with a discussion on the ocean's role in climate mitigation. Where are we in terms of being able to quantify the ocean carbon sink? What is the demand for mCDR and what are the global constraints? Or what are the requirements and consequences of using mCDR in a climate mitigation strategy? So we have three folks with us here to get this started. Tim DeVries from University of California, Santa Barbara, Andres Clarence from University of Virginia, and Nico Bauer from Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. So we'll hear from each of them, and then we will open up the discussion, which will be moderated by Scott. So Tim, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. Thanks, Scott.
Welcome. Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Tim.
Yeah. So I was asked to talk about the natural ocean carbon sink of the ocean's kind of natural role in mitigating climate change. So thanks for having me here. Again, I'm Tim DeVries. I'm at UC Santa Barbara. So I'm just starting off with this schematic showing the exchange of carbon between the various carbon reservoirs on Earth. This is kind of for a contemporary snapshot of the cycling of carbon. And I guess we're all gathered here mostly because of that arrow right there, which is the combustion of fossil fuel CO2, fossil fuel carbon, which releases CO2 to the atmosphere. So that's currently around 10 gigatons of carbon per year that are extracted out of the geological reservoir, fossil fuel reserves, which is, of course, highly concentrated carbon, and then released to the atmosphere as CO2. I just thought it was interesting to put that in perspective. It takes a lot of people and money to generate that amount of carbon coming out of that concentrated carbon reservoir and emitting it to the atmosphere. So $3 to $4 trillion per year is the revenues of those companies that do that. Quite a lot, employing 30 million people. So us CDR folks have our work cut out for us to go the reverse of that. So about half of that accumulates in the atmosphere as CO2. So roughly 5 gigatons of carbon per year, which is about 2.5 ppm of CO2 per year. And then the remaining 50% is taken up by natural carbon sinks. So we have the terrestrial biomass, which takes up some CO2, and then the ocean also takes up CO2 as well. So that's where we're going to go next, to that ocean carbon sink. So the ocean is the largest reservoir of carbon that kind of actively, rapidly, on climate relevant timescales, exchanges with the atmosphere. So it's very important as a natural carbon sink. So this exchange of CO2 between the ocean and atmosphere occurs as CO2 enters the atmosphere or evades the ocean, or enters the ocean or evades the ocean by gas exchange, and it's roughly 90 gigatons carbon per year that's cycled through that that gas exchange component there. Once in the ocean, the CO2 is converted to DIC, so that's the sum of all the inorganic carbon species that are in the ocean, including CO2. And then another important component of that natural carbon cycle is the cycling through the organic carbon. So by photosynthesis and respiration, roughly about 50 gigatons carbon per year cycles through that organic carbon pool, which is quite a small pool, but has an important climate effect, as we'll see through the biological pump. All right, so kind of zooming in onto that first box that I talked about there, the air-sea exchange of CO2. This can kind of be conceptualized and has been conceptualized as the sum of different components. So this equation kind of lays that out. On the left, we have the air-sea CO2 flux, which I just said is around 90 gigatons carbon per year in kind of the gross fluxes. And then on the right is those three different components. So I'll start at the far right of the screen. There's a natural component, which is just due to the carbon that was in the ocean pre-industrially before humans started emitting lots of CO2 to the atmosphere. And then there is a component that's due to this increase in CO2 in the atmosphere due to human activities. That's the anthropogenic CO2. And then there's a component that's also due to just climate variability, for example, El Nino, things like that, or climate changes that are driving carbon in or out of the ocean. So it's helpful to conceptualize it in this way. Again, the kind of gross flux is contemporary around 90 billion tons carbon per year, and about 60 of that is those natural pre-industrial fluxes. The net flux is much smaller, so the ocean's currently net flux is around 2, roughly maybe 2.5 gigatons carbon per year. Natural, there was actually an efflux of carbon from the ocean to the atmosphere. So what's the ocean carbon sink? It's those two in the middle there, which are basically much smaller than either of the two on the end. So that's the ocean carbon sink. That's the net kind of human perturbation to the global carbon, the air-sea CO2 flux. So the anthropogenic CO2 and the climate-driven fluxes. If you're reading the global carbon budget at any point, that would be called S-ocean in the global carbon budget. Ocean sink. It's interesting to think about how we determine each of these things. So the only one that's directly observable is the sea to air flux. In theory, one could observe that. In practice, globally speaking, we can't observe it over the whole entire globe. So we have to use models or kind of like observation gap filling products to estimate this flux. Any of the other terms on the right-hand side are just estimated by models. So all the stuff that I'm going to show you is going to come from models. If you think about where CDR fits in there, I think it would just be another term on the right-hand side, which is plus a flux from CDR. So that's going to be something that also models are going to be needed, of course, to estimate. So these two maps here are the two main components of that. Excuse me. The top one is just the contemporary air-sea CO2 flux. So that's the total CO2 flux. The bottom one is that natural pre-industrial flux. So again, that's just from a model. These are both from models. So model estimates. To first order, they look very, very similar. So the kind of net flux that's happening is, in large part just driven by that pre-industrial baseline that we had before humans started perturbing the carbon cycle. And so these exchanges are driven by exchanges of heat between the ocean and atmosphere, biological carbon cycling, and also the ocean circulation and overturning. I just put rough energy numbers on those things just for comparison. It's fun to compare to global energy consumption by humans. So these are, clearly a lot of work that the ocean is doing to exchange this carbon with the atmosphere. Yes, anything else to say about this one? Oh, sorry, the red here, the positive numbers are going to be outgassing of carbon from the ocean to the atmosphere, whereas blue is going to be an uptake of carbon from the atmosphere to the ocean. Again, as I mentioned before, at the natural, pre-industrial steady state, scientists estimate that the ocean was actually losing carbon to the atmosphere by a degassing of carbon that came from the land into the ocean by rivers. And not enough carbon was buried in sediment, so some carbon was lost to the atmosphere. Kind of aside, I guess, is this biological pump, which is very important for that natural carbon cycle to maintain those fluxes that you just saw there, and also to help the ocean to absorb carbon from the atmosphere. So the biological carbon pump refers to the export of carbon from the surface ocean as organic carbon into the deeper layers where it's then remineralized, and that carbon would then be exposed back to the atmosphere as the waters upwell to the surface again. So there's three main kind of pathways of this carbon pump. One is just the gravitational sinking of particles, organic carbon particles that are produced in the surface. So these could be just aggregates of phytoplankton that stick together and sink down. They could be the feces and carcasses of little animals like zooplankton or bigger animals like fish. So that's roughly, we think, around half of the total of 10 billion tons of carbon that's exported by the biological pump. And it contributes to a sequestration of roughly, let's say, 1,000 billion tons of carbon down there in the deeper ocean. These sequestration times I'm showing here, this is like how long that carbon is held in the deeper ocean before it's then brought back up to the surface where it can exchange with the atmosphere. So this is relevant, of course, to CDR strategies that kind of seek to enhance these fluxes of carbon from the surface to the deeper ocean, these biological fluxes. The mixing pump is just the mixing of organic carbon from the surface to the interior. That stuff doesn't get mixed as deep, so it doesn't have as high a sequestration time, and so it doesn't contribute to as much of a buildup as the gravitational pump pathway, for example. And the export is not as large as the gravitational pump. And then interesting one that we probably know the least about is the migrant pump. So this is driven by migrations of animals, zooplankton or fish, and they're feeding in the surface, and then they're moving that carbon down to the deeper layers, and they're excreting that carbon in deeper layers and contributing to carbon sequestration as well. So those, depending how deep they go, could have quite a long sequestration time, the carbon that's excreted by those organisms. And to top it all off, there's actually another effect, which is air-sea disequilibrium. It actually enhances this sequestration by roughly 35 to 70%, depending on whom you ask about that. I guess the interesting thing I'll mention about this figure here, this is a paper from Dave Siegel, recent review paper, is the right-hand panel there shows the sequestration by these different pathways as a function of depth. So you see that the sequestration can happen anywhere in the ocean. It could happen towards the surface, it could happen in the deeper ocean. And in fact, according to the model estimates at least, roughly half of the sequestration happens in what we would consider not necessarily the deep ocean, like the middle ocean, above 1,000 meters. And then roughly half of that sequestration happens below 1,000 meters. So it's not only happening in the deep ocean, it's happening all throughout the ocean. Of course, the sequestration time, which is the middle panel, increases as you get deeper in the ocean. So that is important. This is the anthropogenic carbon component. So this is showing a net uptake everywhere by the ocean. So this is just driven by the increase in atmospheric CO2. And over time, since the industrial era began, the ocean has absorbed about 200 gigatons of carbon, roughly now 3 gigatons per year. And that's about a 0.5% increase in the DIC inventory of the ocean because there's just so much natural DIC there in the ocean. Importantly, the biological pump is not important for this uptake. It's not, it's just simply doesn't contribute to the anthropogenic carbon uptake. It contributes to the natural carbon fluxes, but not so much the anthropogenic. And then the very last component of the ocean carbon sink is these climate-driven fluxes. So these actually have very small values on the long term, but they do contribute to kind of shorter year-to-year variations in the carbon sink. This is a figure showing over the past 30, 40 years of air sea CO2 fluxes. The red is the anthropogenic CO2, so there's a lot of carbon going in from the anthropogenic CO2 and kind of steadily increasing over time. The green is these climate-driven fluxes. They're roughly around zero, but they do vary year to year. When we have an El Nino, for example, that can affect the ocean carbon sink. However, to me, they're like kind of surprisingly small when you think about El Nino events releasing the energy equivalent of millions of hydrogen bombs per NOAA. It doesn't have a huge impact on the global atmospheric CO2, which I do think also relates to what we're up against for making CDR work. Um, Yeah, I'll just end with that slide there showing those different carbon component sink components. And then maybe to this table, we will eventually have to add a CDR term if we're able to get that industry going. And then, produce estimates for how much carbon the ocean is taking up through CDR activities. So thanks for listening. Take any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. I do want to roll through the next two talks and then kind of have a discussion with everyone. So everyone, if you can hold your questions, and just want to make sure we don't run out of time. So next we have Andres Clarence from University of Virginia. He's going to talk about, or start our talk about integrated assessment models.
Thanks, Kelly. Let me share my screen here, and I want to thank everybody for being here and Kelly for having me. This is work. What I'm going to present on today is a little bit of an introduction to integrated assessment models and how they contribute to a broader discussion about mCDR and CDR in general. This is a lot of the results that I'm going to present are results that were generated this summer by a PhD student in our lab, Parissa, who's on the call as well, when she had a fellowship to go to IASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Austria. The team that has been doing CDR work at UVA includes Scott, your fearless leader here, and Jay Furman, who I believe was actually the first choice for giving this presentation at PNNL, a former PhD student in our lab, and Jay couldn't make it today, so I'm the pinch hitter, but that's okay. I'll do my best. These are some of the folks, not the entire roster of folks that have worked on CDR modeling in integrated models in our group over the past 5 or 6 years, but these are the ones that are working on it now and supporting Parissa in some of her work. And these are some of our funders. What are integrated models? I recognize that the majority of the folks on the call today are coming more from the environmental science, oceanography side of things. Integrated models are fundamentally economic models. And so this is the appendix to Bill Nordhaus's work at Yale. Bill won this is work he did in the early 1990s that won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2018. But this was basically an effort to try and model the whole world economy as it relates to energy and climate, and sort of initiate this whole field of integrated assessment models. And so this is a highly stylized, simplified integrated model. And today we use we use what are called technology-rich integrated models. And so they're still fundamentally economic models. And I will say I am not an economist, I'm an engineer, but my role in these collaborations is to represent emerging technology as an engineer, thinking about the systems implications of these technologies, And so the models work essentially by, in different ways, but essentially by having sort of reduced form versions of hydrologic models, land use models, energy system models, and they sort of wrap it all together. And then there isn't, unfortunately, like a really fun Sim City, but that's kind of what we're getting at here. There isn't like a fun video game in the middle of this. But at the end, we do get these projections of what is likely to happen on a decade time scale in terms of different technology deployment. And you can model, you can imagine all of the different things that come along with trying to model such a complex, large system over such long time scales. You've got, many sensitivities. You've got to take into account, how new technologies get adopted, how we learn about them, how they get cheaper over time, et cetera. And so the results from these types of models are useful in different contexts. So the most obvious one is sort of in IPCC international discussions around where we're going with the climate system and what contributions from different countries are and what different policies are that might support achieving goals like limiting warming to 2 degrees. But these types of models are also useful at the national stage. So I spent some time along with Scott in the White House in the Office of Science, Technology Policy during the previous administration. Trisha was there, who I think is on the call as well. And so we were in different parts of the White House. I was working on industrial policy. Scott was working in climate, but the reason that these types of models were discussed in that setting is that whenever CDR came up, the question was a lot less technological in nature and often more economic in nature. Like, what are the markets going to look like that are going to support scaling CDR at the levels that we would need in order to sort of matter for the climate at the scale the climate's going to notice. And so understanding how this type of technology might stack up against all the other things we can do in the mitigation space is a really important question, and one of the things that IAMs can offer when you think about understanding when and at what level these types of technologies might be deployed. So a lot going on in this graphic, but let me just say that what this is an effort to take a few of the big integrated models because it is a pretty diverse ecosystem in the integrated modeling space. There are a number of models. When the IPCC gathers, they use ensemble modeling, so they take results from a number of different integrated models that come from around the world. This is a slide that Parissa made where she tried to look at a bunch of the different European integrated models and then GCAM, which is the one that we use in our lab. And she tried to represent essentially which forms of CDR are currently included in these different models. And so what you have sort of here is the different classes of CDR and then whether or not they are sort of in process in terms of being represented in these integrated models or whether they already exist. And so the work that we've done over the past 5 or 6 years with our colleagues at PNNL that produce GCAM is we've included things like direct air capture into GCAM so that we can understand what the economics of that might look like and how getting down the cost curve in DAC might lead to its deployment at scale over the coming decades. If you look across these other models, you can see many of these are from the EU, as you can see different parts of the EU. I put a star above some of them because some of these models are actually primarily energy system models, and so there's the integrated modeling community does sort of overlap a little bit with energy systems models, and energy systems models might not have some of the sort of Earth systems dynamics as fully represented as a complete integrated model. And so I just wanted to flag that distinction for folks that might not be familiar with this space as much. But if you look across the ocean based CDR, you see that it's not really that well represented in any of the integrated models. There are a few of the teams that are working on trying to capture it in their model. And I will point out that Parissa's internship that she had this summer, or her fellowship that she had, which was a really cool experience for her, she worked with Message, which is one of the EU's primary integrated models. And so different results from GCAM. And the one thing I will say to sort of frame why these models might get to different places or get to different results is that they're structured in different ways. And so GCAM is a market equilibrium integrated model, meaning that it balances supply and demand. message is a optimization model. And so you give it a constraint. In all of these integrated models, you give it a constraint. And so, for example, in GCAM, one that we often use is what would it look like to get to net zero by mid-century? In message, you would say, what does it look like to get, you could say, what would it look like to get to 2 degrees warming, limiting that. And so this is like an overarching constraint on the model, but the underlying mechanics of how the model achieves that goal varies. And so it's important to just be sensitive to the fact that these models sort of work. What's under the hood is different, even though they are all fundamentally economic models. So I didn't have one of these for GCAM, but for message, but I had one for GCAM. This is from Jay Edmonds, who was the who was the sort of founder of GCAM, or initiated a lot of the early work, and still is at PNNL driving a lot of this work. But I think that the main thing to point out is that these are pretty big models, and they have a lot that they need to capture. I mentioned that it's sort of intrinsic to the model is capturing some of these Earth system, reduced form, obviously, simplistic representations of hydrology, of ocean systems, of agriculture and land use, and then energy systems. And then you give it some exogenous assumptions, you give it some data, and it outputs a variety of different things. So it can tell you what the carbon price is. It can tell you, the scale. What we usually look for is the level at which different technologies are being deployed, both in terms of positive emissions and then also in terms of negative emissions. So when it comes to marine CDR, this is a graphic that I borrowed from a review paper that Scott and Jay put out earlier this summer. We have already represented to the furthest to the right here, which is direct CO2 stripping, essentially. So pulling CO2 from surface waters out, coupling it with desalination or dedicated plants. And that's in this paper here to the right. The total amount of carbon that can be removed using these approaches is quite low, mostly because it's expensive in this configuration. And so at least our first pass at including this ocean form of CDR in GCAM doesn't get like enormous amounts of deployment. What Parissa's project for the summer was to represent ocean alkalinity enhancement in message first, and now we're working on getting it included and represented correctly in GCAM. But this is the technology that you all are going to talk quite a bit about, and so it's the idea that you can add alkalinity to surface waters and in that way influence the carbon cycling in the way that Tim talked about a while ago. So if you think about the big picture and what any of these integrated models would need to know in order to represent the technology, you need to know about sort of full life cycle representation of what deploying that technology might look like, and then also you would need to know what the sort of life cycle costing of that would be. And so if you think about the whole supply chain, so in Parissa's work, she modeled enhanced rock weathering and ocean alkalinity enhancement together because the supply chain sort of looks they sort of parallel each other, but the basic idea is you're going to have to mine some rocks, you're going to have to process that rock, and then you're going to have to either apply it on soil or you're going to have to apply it in the ocean. And and so sort of representing all of this, collecting the literature and having the life cycle representation was sort of the first step. The second is understanding the ocean system. And so she represented the ocean as this patchwork based on the Zhao paper here. And the way in which she whittled this down further was to say, okay, well, economically, this is going to be done, and politically, I guess, the focus should be on the exclusive economic zone. So near coastal regions where if you're going to be mining this stuff on land and you're going to be taking it out into the ocean, the most economical option is going to be to focus on these like relatively near shore patches of ocean in which to do this. And so that was where she focused her modeling. And so the results look like this. So the first thing to point out is that you get very little deployment of these technologies. And I should mention that DAX is direct air capture and BECCS is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And so in most of the integrated models, these two technologies are the ones that are the most mature, and so you get the most of these technologies being deployed. And so you see that here as well. So if you look at the purple and the green, this is most of what the model picks for deployment. In these message results, you see very little deployment of CDR of any kind. Again, I mean, the scale here is pretty big. So even 1 or 2 gigatons would be, I think Tim did a good job of describing like the scale of what we're talking about here. And so when you think about how much economic activity it requires to put a certain number of gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere in a positive way today, that for me, that's a useful way to frame what it would look like to do that in the negative, right? Like think about all of the oil and gas industry, all the fossil fuel industry globally. Now we're talking about doing that, but in reverse. And so that helps put the scale of some of these activities in context. But so if you look across these, the majority of this deployment of mCDR occurs in the second half of the century. And by the way, I will say, because it matters for the result, the constraint that Persa put on the model was 2 degrees warming by the end of the century with net zero emissions by 2070. So that's what these results. That's what led to these results. And so the model picks some enhanced rock weathering and some ocean-based alkalinity enhancement, but it's very it's loaded towards the end of the century. So and the model can represent improvements in price, improvements in efficiency. The model is very sensitive to essentially the latency period. So how long do you add alkalinity to the ocean? How long before you start to see a flux or a change in carbon removal taking place? That has a big effect on how much the model picks that particular technology. And so you can see that here. If you assume immediate removal, in other words, you add alkalinity and carbon is removed from the ocean or from the atmosphere immediately, you get absolutely wild amounts of deployment. So just really, really, really big. If you take a more realistic gradual removal approach where there is a multi-year lag between when the alkalinity is added and the signal is observed, you get more modest deployment of these technologies, but nothing in which we have large amounts of deployment before the middle of the century. In terms of where in the world, this is one of the things the integrated models allow you to do. There's many things they let you do, but one of them is look at where in the world this is going to be deployed. And what we see is that a lot of it gets deployed in the global south. And this was true when we first started modeling direct air capture and bioenergy with carbon capture. A lot of that has to do with just cheaper land, cheaper labor. And so the model tends to pick deployment there. And so, these are all, I just want to reiterate, very preliminary results. And so we're sort of trying to unpack why it is that you do get this distribution of deployment in say sub-Saharan Africa, for example, a lot in Asia. And so, but it's a useful tool. I mean, the models are coarse, and so the global land use system is divided into 12 regions in message, and GCAM it's a little bit higher, it's 30 some regions, but still it's a very coarse representation. And so beginning to think about sort of the political realities and the economic realities associated with what this result really means is a helpful starting point to begin to think about where we might do this and where we might not. So that's as quick of a job as I could give for introducing integrated models to this group. And yeah, excited for the conversation a little bit. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And continuing this conversation will be Nico, and then we will take some questions. Nico, do you want to share your screen?
Hello. So this is Nico from Germany, from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. So our model has been already a little introduced. I can give you then some more insights. So I hope I will do it in 10 minutes. So this is how we included marine calm removal into the integrated assessment model REMIND, or REMIND MAGPIE. This is work supported by the European Union Optimism Rescue Project and also the German science support of retake. So I'm given a relatively straight down to the matter introduction. So this is what we already basically saw. So we mine and grind the material, a calcium carbonate. We could also go for silicate minerate or hydrate carbonate minerals, but here we basically look for calcium carbonate. So this is basically then the first thing, mining, grinding, calcination. This is basically what cement production looks like. We have emissions in CO2 sequestration that is necessary because the CO2 during the production process should also be removed and put underground. So this is something to be considered that improves the eco balance of the process. Then when we put the stuff into the ocean, this is a very costly process also. We have to take into account that there should not be precipitation. That happens if the calcium carbonate concentrations get too high, and then you can have just the opposite effect. So this is a real risk also of the process. This depends on the discharge rates. And then one of the big questions is, what is the ocean liming efficiency? So how much CO2 does the ocean actually take up? And this has a lot to do with the hydroxyl chemistry in the oceans, and is one of the big uncertainties. So if we want to capture this process, we can first go for a techno-economic analysis. Techno-economic analysis looks for the cost per a single unit. So not the large scale stuff, that comes later. Now we go down to the units, and we have parameters like the electricity production emissions, and here we assume that the electricity sector is already completely decarbonized. So there already a systems transformation has fully taken place. We have heat emissions, and then it depends on how much the CCS is applied in the calciner for natural gas in this case, so 3 or 59 kilogram per gigajoule. We have fuel emissions. And then also, so this is for the ship basically. And then it also depends, is this decarbonized or not? These are all the problems that life cycle analysis people have. Then we have also the energy requirements for the process. So how much heat, how much electricity, how much diesel. How much money does it cost to build the facilities? How much is the operational cost? What is the energy cost? And what are the material costs? We also have to hire a ship and go on to the ocean, and this all takes a lot of money. And you have only ships available for a certain amount of time. We have then a concentration limit for the discharge and things like this. When we put all that together in a very, very simple kind of business economics model, then we get it. The cost per ton of calcium, so in here it's CaO added, and this depends then on the discharge rate and whether you use natural gas or electricity for the calcifier. Electricity is a technology that produces the heat for the calcifier, but you have then very, very high concentration CO2. And you see, so scale matters, yeah. And many of the components, the cost components, are, however, not responsive to scale. But here the O&M, the distribution, and the diesel costs, they really depend on the scale of the operation. When we look at the uncertainty, so ranking up the parameters with the uncertainty of plus minus 15%, we see that this alkalinity and efficiency, so how much CO2 is really taken up by adding the alkalinity, dominates here. So, and this is really important. The ship speed, the discharge area, so typical engineering type of operational parameters are really important. Yeah. So we can now put all that into an integrated assessment model. And so from the previous presentation, so this is the dice-like part, yeah, where we have the macroeconomy, and here we have the energy system. And now we plug in this new technology. You need investments. You need resources to build up, to ramp up this entire operation. You also need energy. You need the materials that go in, and we put this into this system model, and it emulates already all these assumptions that the LCA people have. Yeah, this kind of what is the electricity production mix and the CO2 emissions? What are the CO2 emissions of the diesel and so on? This is included online, and it has then also an influence on the costs and the profitability. There's also constraints like CCS constraints. Yeah, the CCS from the calcifier competes with other opportunities. So we feed this then also with all different kinds of assumptions that you may know from the shared socioeconomic pathways like population, economic development, and so on. And we combine it with climate policies. Here, I will go for carbon budgets in a second, with and without overshoot. Yeah, we have the same cumulative emissions by 2100 in one case with the smallest possible overshoot, and in one variant where we allow the systems, or to pay, say, or the society to flexibly choose the optimal amount of overshooting. The results look like this. So here you have the annual net emissions. Here you have the cumulative emissions. So for the 1.5 degree target, you have either this path or this path with a full overshoot, but they hit at in 2100 at the very same level. You see that temperatures follow suit, completely in line with the recent findings with Earth system models. I mean, there's also some uncertainty, but overall, the median, so to say, commands that the cumulative emissions and the temperatures are super tightly correlated. So here we have now the mixes for the different scenarios, and like on the previous presentation, we see that yes, OAE comes in only late. We also have to make a constraint on the total of OAE. And this is because it is in a very tight neck-to-neck race with DAC cost-wise. So if you make, if you unconstrain OAE, it can take over DAC completely. Then you make a little change to cost parameters, and then it flips just the other way around. Yeah, and this is that these two options are kind of really close competitors. What we also do is then to downscale the results so that Earth system models can take this up. This looks like this, where we also have the exclusive economic zones, but what we did not really do a good job so far is to bring in more heterogeneity. So what are the sweet spots? What are the places where you may rather not go for it? What I should say here about the timing in these scenarios, one thing I forgot to mention. If there is no overshoot, you would not go for the OAE nor the DAC variant. Yeah, it is only, so to say, if you allow for full overshoot and have these very, very high peak and decline temperature pathways. Many open questions remain, so factors that would suggest early deployment. One of the most important ones that come to my mind is equity, so that the more wealthy nations have to reduce their emissions more early, more quickly, and must rely on all different kinds of technologies, yeah, like OAE included. If you have a common, a uniform carbon price, and every country more or less goes with the same or adds the same CO2 emission reduction technologies and the carbon removal technologies one after the other, it kicks in only late. But it may change if we have very, very strong differentiation of the policies represented by the carbon prices here. The industrial scale-up is very challenging. So can we ramp up quicklime production, extending the carrier fleet and so on quick enough? Everything related to monitoring, reporting, and verification. I mean, nobody is probably surprised that the open ocean is one of the places where you can best cheat. How to solve this? Very important problem. Then the physical limitations, the precipitation, geological concentrations of the activities, governance issues, and marine ecosystems like acidification. Now we come back to this little photo that I showed you in the beginning. So this is in northern Italy, the Lago di Orta. It's a very, very nice place. And whenever you are in Italy, go to this lake. This is so beautiful, incredible. And there's two things that are good to know about Lago di Orta. The one thing is that these little equipment come from this lake. So these espresso machines that probably you guys in the US also know, they're extremely popular all over Europe. And also this lake, as beautiful as it is, used to be a environmental desert, because it is in the heartland of industry in northern Italy, and it was heavily polluted. So in 1985, the pH value was at a minimum level of 3.9. I mean, that is really acidic. And in the years 89 to 90, they added more than 10,000 tons of pure calcium carbonate, yeah, basically rock, and sprayed it over the lake's surface and mixed it. And you can see now here for shallow and deeper waters of the lake, the relatively quick recovery. Yeah, there's also a study, an entire special issue on it. And what this tells us, there is also natural analogs. We already put a lot of stuff into lakes and also into marine ecosystems for nature protection and restoring natural systems. And there's various examples also from Scandinavia. But probably you guys over in the US also did stuff like that. And when you're now putting up a research program, I guess it would be also interesting to know more about these kind of activities. Okay, thanks. Now open for discussion.
Thank you so much, Nico, Tim, and Andres. We're going to extend this session until for another 10 minutes. So that's 1 p.m. in Eastern time, just to allow for a couple questions. And I think that still gives us plenty of time for our MRV, but we will steal a few minutes of the break if we need to. We're not going to cut anybody short. So questions are, Scott, sorry, you were going to moderate.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. I think Lisa and Galen had questions. Lisa, do you want to go first?
I can read Lisa's because it's also another person's related to another question here too. So that's for Tim. You mentioned the biological pump does not contribute to uptake of anthropogenic C, only the natural cycling. What are the implications for mCDR methods that seek to enhance the biological pump?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think there's not any implications, basically. So it's more or less assumed, I guess, in models that the biological pump is not sensitive to, enhancing atmospheric CO2, and so it hasn't really, been affected by human activities. More of an assumption than a finding. But as far as mCDR goes, that would be like a whole separate thing. So I think, one would tack onto that equation another mCDR. And, you could very well increase the uptake of carbon by the ocean by enhancing the biological pump. Whether that's considered anthropogenic carbon or natural carbon is kind of more or less irrelevant, I think, for mCDR. But yeah, thanks for the question.
Sorry, I was muted, but just to clarify, so that just means that the elevated levels of CO2 in the atmosphere that we've seen since pre-industrial times haven't altered the biological uptake of carbon. Is that?
That's right.
Correct?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's no evidence that they have. So that's the assumption that, most people work with. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Galen, did you want to go next, and then Helen?
Sure. I want to ask to the people who run the integrated assessment models, and I think Nico addressed this a little bit, but how are the really serious questions of monitoring, reporting, and verification, including additionality and environmental impacts, how are those accounted for in these integrated assessment models? Is it just basically assumed that those things get worked out, or is there some provision for those issues in the model, in the modeling that you're doing?
Andres, you want to go first, or should I?
Go for it, Nika, since you mentioned it.
Okay, so basically, what you can do is to assume everything is solved and use a mean value, or median value. You can also use a safety margin, or these are the, so to say, straightforward approaches. The other things are, you go for a much more sophisticated approach. One is you make a insurance scheme where companies or some entity, whatever the entity is, has to pay a insurance fee and needs to show to the public and proof. The burden of proof problem is always an issue, as you may know, to show what happened and did it work out? Is the result really realized that was promised? In a model, in an integrated assessment model, you can also use, so integrated assessment models are often accused of being perfect foresight, and you can also switch off and make the model a little blind, and that the model also makes mistakes, and you can ask the question, okay, how strong? What are the consequences of such mistakes? And you can differentiate between the different technologies. So in ocean alkalinization, I mean, this take-up efficiency, this is a really, really tricky thing, yeah? And if you would do a mistake, and you later find out, hey, I did a mistake, damn, I have to correct my initial decision in order to maintain the 1.5 degree target. Now I have to strengthen the policy, yeah? And how, the question then is, how difficult is that? How much are then the costs and the additional efforts that you have to put into it? If that is very, very, very high, then you may say, oh, probably it's better to be a little more careful on the start and not overdo it. We have done a study on the permanency of forests and afforestation that has been published last year or beginning of this year. And there we did it the same logic, basically a hedging strategy for forests. We can do the same for oceans or ocean alkalinity enhancement. And then the question is, okay, the different options, how do they perform in these kind of metrics? Yeah? Okay, thanks.
I guess my question really is, that's great to hear how it can be done. Is what we're seeing in terms of results making those choices, adding that hedging, doing that, or is that something still to be done?
Still to be done.
It's really early days. I mean, and I think not to repeat anything that Nico said, because I think he answered the question super well, but I would only add that in the CDR space, there are those forms of CDR that end with geologic carbon storage, which is like very cut and dry how we think about permanence. And then there are all the ways that don't end in CCS, and then those are different. And so everything that Nico mentioned, you have to like think about it over here, right? And so, well, with the exception of the form of ocean-based, carbon stripping that I mentioned before that does include CCS. So I think that, differentiating, parsing those, and recognizing it's early days in the integrated community representing these processes. And so I think it's a really good flag, though.
Helen, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for very nice and interesting presentations. Regarding the integrated assessment modeling, how well would you say that ocean alkalinity enhancement is represented at the moment, considering, from where I'm sitting, there's a lot of uncertainty around it, and then how reliable are the outcomes from the integrated assessment models compared to other outcomes from the same model, and so how well are they represented, and how useful is the regionalization within the IAMs when it comes to modeling things like ocean alkalinity enhancement? For message has like 11 regions, for instance. And just if you would like to comment on, yes, the ocean alkalinity enhancement is now implemented to some extent. What would your preferred next step be? Would it to improve the representation of ocean alkalinity enhancement or include other forms of marine CDR? Thank you.
Thanks for your question. I can take this one first and then Nico, hand it over to you. But so, I mean, I think that, first of all, we're trying to model things over multiple decades time scales. And so it's important to like just think about what that means, right? I mean, the products of these simulations are not to say this is going to be the answer. We're going to have this many gigatons of this form of CDR in this place at this time, because that's very hard to do. It's really more about understanding what are the underlying sensitivities, what are the relationships that are driving the model to deploy at what time, in which places, using which technologies, and how does that compare to other things. And so it's really, to me anyway, the results are more about understanding the system rather than saying this is is the answer and this is the correct answer. It is also really early days, like I said in my previous answer, with a lot of these ocean-based approaches. And so, 5 years ago, the models didn't even really include direct air capture or some of these really very simple, I mean, from a modeling standpoint, comparatively much simpler processes to represent. You know what I mean? Like, and so I think that as we go into a world, and I think also, we are learning about the world's appetite for deploying carbon capture and storage at scale, for example, right? And that is adjusting sort of our understanding of which technologies might really be viable. And if you don't use certain technologies, you might have to use other technologies. So I think that all of this is a work in progress, and I think it's really early days. And so I think that that's why the work of this committee is so important to help inform how some of these broader systems dynamics might play out. Nico?
Yeah, thank you very much, Andres. Yeah, I have not much to add to your answer. I want to emphasize timing. We both showed that this is not all to be done by tomorrow. We have time. And for a scientific program, it is not very, very important to understand how much time. Yeah, and you should be careful not expect too much from us now. What you, however, should get is, hey, before 2040, there is not much going on there in real world deployment. In our model, it's even 2050. So it's also a question, how long can we wait? Yeah, I mentioned conditions for early deployment. Under what conditions it might be necessary to deploy it early. And this is then when it comes to the equity and the, so to say, the richer countries need to go ahead first. But by how much? And then the question is, okay, if we are too uncertain about this whole ocean alkalinity enhancement, what do we sacrifice if we simply keep our fingers away from it and refrain from it and say, okay, we solve the problem in a different way, do more research, find out more, and maybe do it later? Yeah, thank you very much.
So Kelly,
Lisa, I see your, yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Kelly.
I was just going to say, Lisa, I see your hand up, but I think we need to move on to the next session. Scott, were you going to say the same?
Yeah, I think just to give the other speakers, thank you, Tim, Nico, and Andres, virtual round of applause. And I think we do need to get to the next set of speakers. So thank you.
Thank you. I don't know, is there a way to like write down answers to those questions people put in the Slido? Is that interactive?
You should be able to respond to the questions.
Oh, okay. I'll try to find a way to do that.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. And Lisa and others, if you have other questions, we can compile them when we meet in closed session and then send an email to this group. And I'm sure they will kindly answer us that way. So that's a way to keep the conversation going and answer any additional questions that came up. Okay, so I'm sorry to the next folks for going a little over, but I think we have enough time for this session. So next, we want to get an overview of where things stand with monitoring, reporting, and verification, or MRV, specifically quantifications of carbon removal through open ocean CDR approaches. We'll hear from 4 different speakers who come at this challenge from different angles. So first we have Matt Long, CEO and co-founder of Seaworthy. He'll start us off, followed by Grace Andrews, the Executive Director of Hourglass Climate, and then Frock Crack, the science lead at Frontier Climate and Stripe, and then Ying He, carbon removal scientist at Isometric. So we're really excited to hear from you all. Thank you for your patience. Matt, do you want to kick it off?
Thanks. I think you should be able to see my slides and
yes.
Okay,
yes.
Great. Thanks, Kelly. Thanks for inviting me to speak. I really appreciate the opportunity, and also happy to contribute to the important work that this committee is taking on. Let me just say a few words about where I'm coming from. So um, I am CEO of Seaworthy. Seaworthy is a nonprofit research organization. We're basically established in the context of trying to accelerate the science necessary to conduct high quality and scientifically credible MRV. Our focus is on building modeling tools, but we're approaching this task with some value propositions and guiding principles to ensure that we are tracking sort of ethical approaches in this space. I'd like to, before I get started, acknowledge our funders. We are funded primarily by philanthropic donors, and I've listed the donors at the top there. And we also have funding from the federal government through the ARPA-E program at Department of Energy and NOAA through the National Oceanographic Partnership Program, as well as using DOE and NSF supported computing resources. And then we also collaborate with many people in the commercial and civil society space. Seaworthy is oriented around delivering to the community 3 products. The first is CSTAR, which is a modeling system that is focused on the CDR quantification problem. We're also publishing open data sets to support various things, techno-economic analysis, among others. Andreas featured one of our data sets earlier this morning. And then we are building the CSTAR Ocean Network, which is a growing constellation of regional oceanographic domains that support quantification applications around the world. I'll just highlight again this Ocean CDR Atlas with the QR code if folks want to track these data. Okay, so to sort of frame this talk, I'd like to just put forward a few notes here. So first, CDR is a climate intervention. What makes a climate intervention effective? Well, in the case of CDR, we have to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And then we'd like to establish high integrity frameworks for quantification. So the first principle there is that we need to ensure that MRV is based on accurate, transparent methods of quantification. There's a requirement for transparency, and that social license is really a gating criteria for enabling these technologies to move forward. And then in that space as well is the idea that ecosystem impacts are in principle quantifiable and can be deemed acceptable. Equity, and then actually economic and resource constraints on implementation. What do we mean by accurate and transparent quantification? Well, I think it's important for us to recognize that ocean-based CDR is perturbing the environment at large. It's manipulating the global commons, and so the burden of proof is high. There is, in principle, a requirement that the causal impact of our interventions are, in principle, knowable. But given the nature of these systems, we have to acknowledge that truth is really a product of the social process wrapping the science. And in that space, we must rely on the tenets of transparency and peer review because they're our only access point for establishing consensus around reality-driven framing. Standards provide a really important approach to codifying consensus and make the space operable. And in particular, then we can leverage market mechanisms which promote efficiency and innovation, and if equipped with appropriate standards, can actually address or develop positive outcomes. However, because we are operating in a space where the very science underpinning CDR quantification is still evolving, we must acknowledge that standards have to track evolving science. I think it's important to acknowledge that in the context of the climate crisis, we have some degree of urgency to establish effective mechanisms for CDR deployment. So we're building the plane as we fly it, and we can lump challenges into a space of the open science questions and the research that's needed to be done. But I would also urge the committee to be thinking about what sorts of institutions need to come into being or adapt so as to effectively manage the science. There's a requirement for large-scale investment and collective ownership. We used to rely on the government for that. hopefully we will be able to do so moving forward. But there are other models for collective investment, like public utilities models, the underlying principle there is that there will need to be centralized infrastructure that is basically supported on the basis of collective investment. And then we want to open opportunities for private sector investment, establish effective market structures, and engage civil society mechanisms for regulation. Okay, that was just the preamble. So I'm going to start moving fast through some of the MRV considerations, because I think a lot of this is well established in the community. So first, one of the challenges with ocean MRV is their large spatial scales. I'm just showing you the evolution of a PCO2 plume emanating from a deployment site in a model off the coast of California. We are working with unfavorable signal to noise ratios, signals that are razor thin margins on large background with high variability. And we have a requirement to quantify both the factual and counterfactual to enable quantification of additionality. There's a fundamental challenge in this space in that the processes we're thinking that require quantification in the context of MRV span a range of spatio and temporal scales. This is a nice figure that isometric and put together, and Jing will speak to this later. Our ways of knowing about the world involve a combination of assets. We need to be able to synthesize direct observations of the system, couple those with mechanistic models, and then increasingly rely on data and AI. I think I'm highlighting this because, again, truth is a social phenomenon, and our ability to construct a picture of reality is contingent as much on the receptacle for that information in society as our scientific perspectives within the realm of the academy. I'd like to just go through sort of a flow chart of what happens when you perturb the ocean with a pulse of alkalinity. So add alkalinity to the ocean, that generates a CO2 deficit based on the carbonate chemistry. It introduces the potential for biogeochemical feedbacks that might, for instance, trigger runaway precipitation that reduces the amount of alkalinity. Ultimately, that perturbed water mass is dispersed in the oceanic flow and absorbs carbon from the atmosphere via gas exchange. And that carbon addition to the ocean is stored ultimately predominantly in the bicarbonate form. So I've listed a few questions here that might arise as we're focused on sort of where the alkalinity is being put in, the near field dynamics. And the questions in this space will be answered with a combination of observations and models. In the far field, we transition more from the observations to rely more on models, and I've listed several of the questions that we might seek to answer with an MRV system here. And then ultimately, we need to understand the fate of bicarbonate and the DAC cycling mechanisms that constrain that fate. In the last part of the talk, I'd like to speak a little bit to sort of return to this sort of institutional framing and think about how the science that we're doing needs to couple with the mechanisms by which society is seeking to implement CDR. So first of all, the market presents an important framework. It offers the opportunity to entrain private capital to developing innovative technologies. And so I do not think we can ignore the market. In fact, I think we need to do our best to leverage the potential here. There's really sort of three nominal frameworks for market: the voluntary carbon market, which is characterized by bespoke transactions between individuals; a compliance market, which it has not come into being in this country, but is operating in the EU. And then finally, under Article 6 of the Paris Climate Agreement, offers the opportunity for countries to trade credits, carbon credits, and this has some really interesting implications for ocean-based CDR, which does not actually occur within national boundaries. You may have heard of problematic features of the market, and there's been essentially a market crash of the carbon market in the past few years, due predominantly to articles, for example, in The Guardian and The New Yorker under uncovering sort of specious credits. I think that there's momentum to establish a more robust new market with a focus on integrity and durable removals. I think it's really important to think about the potential context, other contexts in which CDR may operate. One of them is is economic development. And here's a study by the Rhodium Group that quantifies the potential job creation of marine-based CDR. We also need to be thinking about international development goals and the degree to which market mechanisms and CDR might promote the UN Sustainable Development Goals. In the context of market-based accounting, we need to really understand what the frameworks are that we need to support in the context of MRV. And we can imagine that if we're operating on the left side here in a ton-based accounting framework, there's a requirement for relatively high precision in our MRV in the sense that we are attributing tons to a particular project. However, if we can sort of evolve the technology toward a pay-for-practice model, we might think about developing MRV solutions that are really at the aggregate scale under the presumption that we've sort of vetted particular technologies in terms of the basic science underpinning their efficacy. I think it's important to think about how we need to structure collective scale investment. And so I'd just like to walk very briefly through an example here. So if we imagine we're using a computational system for quantification, we have some mechanistic model as shown at the right. We're simulating ERC flux. We're using that to generate an estimate of net carbon removal. This is sort of the infrastructure we're working on building at Seaworthy. We have this computational model. It's wrapped by an orchestration layer that addresses ease of use and accessibility to the commercial sector, and then an integrity layer that tracks, makes the whole calculation auditable and reproducible. We can sort of break down each of these elements in terms of where investment is required. And I'd like to just really highlight in the context here that we will need sustained investments in things like backbone observing networks and large-scale community modeling codes. And those are investment obligations for which the value proposition of an incremental investment is something of a diffuse proposition and really requires us to get to scale before we can operate effectively in that space. On the lower half of the diagram, however, are opportunities where the private sector can make substantial inroads, and this is where public-private partnerships are critical. In the context of enabling this operation to move forward, I think we need to think about how to map knowledge gaps in terms of their impact on the ultimate outcome we care about, which is the assessment of net carbon removal or an ability to make definitive assessments of ecosystem impacts, and really focus our research dollars on the priorities that are critical in that space. As scientists, we're used to thinking about this in terms of the uncertainty budget, and we can imagine various approaches to quantifying uncertainty and or making investments in technology to reduce uncertainty. I think we should also be thinking about how basic technologies might present challenges that fall along an engineering to science spectrum, and then throw in as well the challenges related to ensuring that society is brought along for the ride and can confer social license to operations, as well as what are the market mechanisms that need to come into being to make sure that that system aggregates to positive impact. Here's a diagram that shows the type of structure that we might envision operating on, where some collective establishes consensus on the current best available science that enables suppliers in the market space to begin operation and sell credits. We have to build mechanisms so that we're continuing to learn from those early deployments, and then interfacing with the market to ensure that we are aggregating to trustworthy, high integrity removals at scale, and that accounting is done in the appropriate frameworks. Okay, that's all I had. Thank you.
Sorry, there's the mute button. Thanks so much, Matt. We are going to hold the questions until the end so that we are at least sure to get through everything. So next up is Grace Andrews.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. So I'm Grace Andrews. I'm the founder and executive director of a nonprofit called Hourglass. By way of introduction, Hourglass, we are a nonprofit research organization that is working specifically on ocean alkalinity enhancement, and within that, sort of a subcategory of mineral-based ocean alkalinity enhancement. And our goal as an organization is to really advance the responsible development of this industry in terms of understanding the safety and efficacy of these strategies, and to disseminate our work for the public benefit to ensure that all stakeholders have access to the knowledge around safety and efficacy, so we can all make informed decisions about if, when, and how any of these strategies should move forward. We think about and work on OAE from really two types of perspectives: tool building and field trials. And I'll share over the course of this talk a little bit of our work from both of these categories. So to just get started, because Hourglass's focus is mineral-based OAE, I thought, well, I'll focus my talk on that. Quick definition of what mineral-based OAE means. These are technologies that use the dissolution of natural or synthetic rocks and minerals to generate alkalinity in the ocean and drive a net increase in atmospheric CO2 storage in seawater. So our work at Hourglass, we work a lot doing independent monitoring of field trials conducted by a company called Vesta. So I'll be sharing some information and knowledge that we've learned from our own work, but I want to highlight that the scope for MRV that I'm going to talk about today extends much beyond that. So any type of mineral-based OAE can be deployed in a variety of ways. So you can place minerals directly into the ocean. That's the sort of work Vesta does. Other companies, such as Planetary Technologies, disperse minerals through pipe infrastructure, so wastewater treatment plates and wastewater treatment pipes and such. There are other companies out there dispersing minerals via additions to river systems, ocean liming. There are a whole category of technologies out here that are all basically doing the same thing, adding alkaline minerals for the purposes of dissolution and alkalinity generation. So please keep in mind that although I'll be talking and sharing about results from the Vesta project, the intention here is actually much broader. So this is my incredibly simple diagram of how I think about CDR quantification for these projects. We have sort of supply chain and emissions. Obviously, that's a big part of MRV and net CDR quantification. I've said supply chain here. It is, for these technologies, most emissions do come from the supply chain, but you also have emissions from monitoring your projects and such like that. And then balancing our emissions, of course, we have carbon removal. And here I've broken down carbon removal into a framing that Matt introduced, both near field and far field. And I've broken this apart because, as Matt highlighted, for these types of projects, the space and time where we generate alkalinity is distinct from the space and time where we actually generate carbon removal. So alkalinity is generated in the near field at your project site, and then as that alkalinity disperses into the greater ocean, that's actually where you have the removal. So there is, I think it's a helpful way to think about how we actually quantify gross CDR from these projects. So there are lots of wonderful people out there working on this part of far field modeling. Seaworthy is one of them. Hourglass's focus is really thinking about the project near field. And when we think about project near field for these mineral-based approaches, we have to yet think about it really as two compartments within that. So when you're adding minerals to the ocean, again, by a pipe, boat, whatever, you have a water column that's being impacted. So as the minerals go in, and in some cases, you have minerals actually settling on the seafloor. And so you have a seafloor compartment. We think about these differently because they have really, really different biogeochemical cycles. And the MRV for both of these compartments look very different. So I'm going to focus, as I said, on this section and dive a little bit into what this looks like. So water column, what I want to highlight here is that for these approaches, when you have a water column perturbation, sometimes you have alkalinity that The alkalinity is really just added directly to the water column. And that can be, you can imagine a pipe where you've dissolved some component of your minerals in the pipe. And actually, by the time it comes out the pipe, you really are adding like alkalinity directly to the ocean. So you have a dissolved load constituent. And then sometimes, of course, you actually have a solid phase ending up in water. This is a project from the Avesta style approach where they added olivine minerals into nearshore waters. And so some things that are sort of ubiquitous across the board, however, is one of the really nice things about these approaches is you can measure a real-time counterfactual. Basically, you can just look outside your plume of dissolved, alkalinity, or your mineral plume, or both. And so here you have a little monitoring vessel sitting outside of the plume, and you can use a monitoring vessel or an AUV, zigzag your way through the plume, and actually get sort of baseline or counterfactual in real time alongside your measurement signal. So that's a really, really strong and helpful component of how to rigorously do MRV for these approaches. At this point, and I want to highlight, when I think about where we are today versus the last time the National Academy's report was issued, one of the biggest differences in the state of the science here is that before, these were all conceptual. There basically weren't any field trials. And it was a big question of like, can you measure anything, any parameters, what parameters, on what time scale, on what spatial scale? And where we are today is there have been a number of field trials that have actually been implemented. And what we can say for sure is that actually you can get measurable in situ signals of things like alkalinity, and for some minerals, other trace elements as tracers for them. So we can do this via sensors, and there's been a lot of work on alkalinity sensors, or you can use your traditional bottle samples. But either way, one thing that's a major, major advancement is we actually know from multiple field trials that you can actually just measure alkalinity at your project site. For solid phase, probably unsurprisingly, if you're looking at this photo of the Vesta trial, you can also measure solid phase in situ. And so we can look at both of these and get discrete measurements at these in the near field. Again, sensors and bottle samples, sort of redundant approaches. As I said, there are a lot of different techniques that you can do this. And I want to highlight actually that when you're thinking about plume monitoring, I'm focused on mineral-based OAE right now, but this idea of being able to track a plume is also the same if you're thinking about the recent Woods Hole field trial, right? There, it was a very similar approach of how do we sort of zigzag our way through our plume and really monitor that and the counterfactual in real time. Highlighting some of the differences between the different types of approaches. If you have a pipe deployment, you're collecting these measurements basically continuously. If your pipe is moving, then you're collecting measurements. For discrete or boat-based mineral deployments, these measurements are really actually closer to like your monitoring period is hours to days. So it's a very short period. And after that, we really start in the framework of measure and model, moving into the modeling side of things. So the transport of solid phases in the water column and the transformation as those solid phases dissolve to the dissolved phase through space and time. These are things that can be modeled via coupled particle transport models and mineral dissolution models, strengthened by, again, field data validation. So that's kind of an overview of how we can, at the high level, think about MRV for the water column perturbations. I thought I'd also spend just 2 seconds, a picture's worth 1,000 words. This is some of our preliminary data, again, from the Vesta field trial, just demonstrating actually how very measurable this stuff is. So this is some turbidity data from this exact deployment at different depths in the water column. And again, we have sort of pre and post, getting that real-time baseline. Again, very measurable. And then over here we have nickel. Nickel is a trace element in olivine. And so we can get in situ water column measurements actually tracking olivine dissolution. And so this is really compelling, particularly given, as Matt said, we live in a world where modeling is going to be a part of these. Getting multiple types of data to parameterize and then validate models is critical. Moving right along, that's thinking about a water column perturbation. And then, of course, as I said, with some of these minerals, you will end up having minerals settling on the seafloor. And MRV, as I said, looks very different there. So this box sort of ticks on when your mineral dissolution timescale is greater than your particle settling timescale. And basically that means if your mineral dissolution timescale is on the order of days to years. So an olivine mineral, this is pertinent, but also, again, like the early planetary field trial using brucite, this is also relevant. And so it's not not relevant for all mineral-based approaches, but certainly for a meaningful subset of them. What does this look like? Well, again, we have the benefit of real-time counterfactuals, and that because the minerals are limited in their spatial extent, you can monitor control sites sort of further down your coastline or wherever you may be and get that real-time counterfactual as well. So again, a real strength to this part of the MRV process. And what can we measure here? Again, this was a huge question a few years ago. Can you, if you have minerals sitting on the seafloor, gradually dissolving, can you get a resolvable signal there, or will it be basically just diluted beyond the point of measurability? And what we know now is that the answer is very much yes, you can get measurable, very measurable signals. And this is a massive achievement. So alkalinity, what we know now is this can be measured directly on the seafloor using standard oceanographic equipment, benthic flux chambers, or through discrete pore water samples. And again, this has been demonstrated now at multiple field trials. And then on the, of course, on the solid phase, you can also measure that quite easily, actually. Again, traditional approaches, bathymetry, discrete sample collection, and people are working on really novel proxies to try and make MRV like easier and cheaper and more suitable for a commercial implementation. And so here we have the three-dimensional bathymetry of, again, that Vesta field trial. And then again, like all things, the transport of the solid phase and again, the transformation to the dissolved phase as those minerals dissolve. One of the limitations here is that these are sort of just, well, largely discrete samples. And so how do you take spot measurements through space and time and extrapolate them to larger spatial and temporal scales? This is where we, again, rely on models. And so here we think about coupling sediment transport models with what are called sediment reaction transport models. Again, a major strength here is these can be validated with data, field data. And so I'd say the modeling component here, and I'll spend a little more time on that, is really where I see the greatest need for significant future research. But just to highlight how measurable, again, these signals are, these are our real data from the Vesta field trial. These are pore water profiles. Again, we have that like nickel tracer commonly found in olivine at our olivine site compared to a control. And you see, you know, again, the equivalent changes to the carbonate system. You see these really significant changes in pH. You see decreases in PCO2. And I'll have some other data, carbonate system data later. So we can measure these things pretty, I wouldn't say it's simple to collect these measurements, but they can be done rigorously because the signal to noise ratio is actually not nearly as bad as we maybe thought it was going to be. You can measure mineralogy very well, XRD. And again, this is a huge advance relative to where we were. And then we can also measure those over significantly longer timescales than I think I certainly thought we'd be able to do years ago. So this is the data at 3 weeks, and then 7 months later, we're still getting, you know, pH changes in the sediment pore water of, you know, 0.2, 0.3 pH units, which is quite substantial. So what we know now is these signals, we can measure them and they persist from weeks to even years timescales. But eventually, no matter what mineral you're working with, eventually you'll reach a time scale where the signals will fall below our measurement capability, our detection limits. And again, that's where models take on. And so to highlight some of the modeling approaches that are needed to really round out rigorous MRV here, this is an example of a sediment transport model. So again, you build a project, minerals end up on the seafloor, you do some bathymetry and some spot sampling of discrete samples, but how do you understand really how that expands over the larger spatial scales of a coastline? So here we use Delft 3D as a sediment transport model to model the movement of, in this case, again, the olivine over the time scale of about a year. And what's nice about these is, Delft 3D is, there's something like 15,000 publications out there. This is like not something we invented. What's novel here is that we're taking really well-established models and then that have basically been tailored around minerals like quartz and asking questions about how do the parameterizations within them change when you're looking at minerals like olivine. So there is some work there, but in general, we're using really well-established frameworks. And then, as I said, the sort of last piece here is thinking about how do we fill the spatial and temporal gaps in the data for the actual dissolution side of things. So we can model where minerals go. How do we model over larger spatial and temporal scales the chemical perturbation? So this is where we use reaction transport models. So this is a model that, we're showing how a sediment profile is evolving again over a year. Reaction transport models, again, are dime a dozen. There are a lot out there. They're used in oceanography. They're also used in enhanced rock weathering on land. But what's novel and what we're personally doing at Hourglass is taking existing reaction transport models and making them sort of bespoke to mCDR. So although these models are out there and they're sort of, as I said, dime a dozen, they don't typically have things like, alkaline minerals in them, right? That's unique to mCDR. So we're adding those kinds of new minerals in there and the associated chemical reactions. And then the other big thing is we're making them more suitable for coastal environments because that is where most of these projects are currently deployed and likely to be deployed in the future. So, and coastal environments have their own sort of complex biogeochemical processes and hydrodynamics that you just don't find out in the deep sea, where a lot of these models were originally built for. So this is how you sort of take field data and the sort of models you need to tie it all together, again, simply for that near field piece. And just to exemplify, the progress we've made already, this is again, in the solid lines here are real field data from the Vesta project site for a bunch of carbonate parameters, and the dashed lines overlaying are the model predictions based on the model we're building radio. So we're doing pretty well, but of course, it's actually one model is not sufficient. We're going to need to do inter-model comparisons and validate across a number of field trials to really get us to the place where you could use this for rigorous carbon quantification. Last thing I want to just highlight, I'd be remiss if I didn't say this, MRV, we typically think about it with regards to carbon quantification. Hourglass is a really, really, really big proponent of the concept of eMRV and making sure that we're thinking about environmental impact quantification in our MRV approaches as well. This is something we're also working on. We have recently built what we're calling the framework for ecotoxicological modeling of mCDR, which is itself a quantification framework for environmental impacts in the near field of mineral-based OAE approaches, as well as a wider swath of mCDR technologies as well. And so it's trying to, again, bring the idea of quantification that we're so used to thinking about for carbon removal, but to environmental impacts to make sure that these considerations don't get left behind. Great, that's what I had. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Grace. There's that mute button again. So we're going to go ahead and save the questions for the end. And I want to go ahead and move on to Frauke. And am I saying your name right?
Yes, yeah. My name is Frauke Kacke. It's a mouthful. It's proper German. Sorry about that.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Of course. Thanks for having me. Let me see. Did I switch correctly? Yeah, this looks good. Okay, thank you all. As I said before, and thanks Kelly and the team for having me. I'm Frauke Kacke. I'm the science lead at Frontier, which is a group of carbon removal buyers. So I wanted to take the opportunity and give a bit of a perspective of what it looks like to be early purchaser of carbon removal, including marine CDR, in a space where the science is constantly evolving, how we think about that, and why we think that like early purchases can help not only drive forward deployment to the scale that we ultimately need, but then also help drive forward like science and scientific questions, and specifically to MRV. So I want to talk a little bit about what Frontier is, because people might not be so familiar with it, how we think about our role in the carbon removal space, specifically focus on mCDR, and then going a bit deep on our point of view on MRV challenges and how we think about that. So Frontier is, as I said, like a buyer, a collective. We have over $1 billion to spend on carbon removal, and really our North Star goal is to build from the ground up a carbon removal market that is robust and gets to the scale that we need in 2030, 2050, and in the future. And the way we're doing that is by purchasing in two different ways mainly. One is like a pre-purchase track where we support very small scale novel deployments. We call that pre-purchases, typically on the order of like $500,000, building a small first of a kind field trial or demonstration plant in the field to really de-risk the technology and prove the efficacy. And then the bigger part of our fund is spent on offtake contracts, and these are longer contracts, multi-year contracts, which are paid upon delivery. The volume is typically something on the order of like 20, 50, $70 million. But here again, like the distinction is very important to make, that those are paid upon delivery, which is verified against like protocols and with a third party verifier. And we look for carbon removal solutions that are we're tech agnostic, look for solutions that fulfill our core criteria of like that look at scalability, safety, verifiability, and cost effectiveness at large scale. So that's important and includes mCDR. What have we done today? We have like over 50 carbon removal purchases signed, like over $500 million, just north of $500 million contracted today, including a variety of carbon removal technologies, including marine CDR. Importantly, our role as a buyer, as I said before, or like try to allude to before, is not only, it doesn't end by like paying for a carbon removal credit. Really, how we see ourselves is that there's a lot of role that we can take in building the market, right? Like by influencing others, and especially in the realm of like standard setting and really defining what does good look like, right? So like what types of like requirements do we have for measurement and verification, and purchasing these credits in order to like build a robust market that doesn't move ahead of the current scientific knowledge, right? Specifically for mCDR, what does it look like in practice? So I think what's different also, like from where the last reports then in 22 and where we are now, I think like really important to highlight here, we purchased from 9 mCDR projects, all abiotic approaches, direct air capture as well as alkalinity enhancement. We approved a first credit issuer as well as a specific protocol for alkalinity addition with coastal outfalls. And I guess Ying after me will get really into depth on that. We accepted first delivered and verified tons from a small scale deployment that we and external experts went through all the data and got comfortable with the verification process here. So this is a really important try run to go through. And then importantly, I want to highlight too, we have 3 pay on delivery, these like large scale offtake contracts that I talked about that we signed with crew and carbon run. These are inland water alkalinity addition, so like adding alkalinity to wastewater treatment plants or rivers. So one can argue this isn't really ocean, even though the ocean storage is integral part of that approach, obviously. And then very recently, after intensive diligence and a lot of back and forth with the scientific community and really thinking through on what a first offtake in ocean alkalinity enhancement should look like. We signed the deal with Planetary, which I think you'll hear more about in upcoming sessions as well. So I think it's really exciting progress, kind of slow and kind of fast. It depends on how you look at it, but to me it's very exciting, and we spend a lot of time really thinking through the nitty-gritty details on what responsible moving here looks like. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about how we think about mCDR specifically. You know, I'm going to talk a lot about OAE, as I think most of the previous speakers as well. So maybe this is nothing new, but mCDR, obviously, and the future report and the updates here will focus on a variety of approaches. As a buyer, they naturally group into biotic and abiotic approaches, and as a buyer, we look at all the different carbon removal solutions and then vet them against our core criteria in terms of like where we see most potential for building the carbon removal market of the future, and then also where commercial activity is warranted, right? Like where can we move forward in the scaling process, and where are we really at the realm of like fundamental science? So here I want to show like this heat map table, which should highlight a little bit like key challenges and risks across core criteria that we think about for mCDR technologies: durability, scalability, cost, MRV, and environmental risk. Now, these type of heat map tables are never perfect, right? But directionally, this should be right. Individual approaches within these pathways can have very different profiles. I think my key point here is really there's a lot of when we say mCDR, we need to understand that there's a lot of different approaches under this, which have very, very different risk profiles and requirements for MRV and environmental risk, for example. So then from our standpoint out, where we focus on highly durable CDR on the order of 1,000 year or more, and then if you overlay that with a very high scalability criteria, we really think that the biggest potential here lies in the abiotic approaches, because for biotic approaches, it's really hard to achieve both at the same time while having a clear path forward to MRV, as well as tracking unintended ecosystem consequences, right? But we are very excited about ocean alkalinity enhancement in particular, given this big storage capacity in the oceanic buffer system, and we think that the MRV challenge and the ecosystem risk can be controlled with very stringent guardrails up and under certain conditions. So I think that's really important. So again, we are really excited about these approaches, but it's really important to put the right guardrails up, because again, not every approach is the same, and not per se any carbon removal approach, especially including ocean alkalinity enhancement, is ready for quantification under all conditions. But we think that for certain conditions, so for example, if we're able to very accurately quantify the amount of alkalinity added, and if we work in a location where we have good models for baselining, as well as modeling the acid-gas exchange and all these kinds of things, then we think there is a path forward to quantification that is acceptable to our bias, which we've proven, right? And there's a bunch of documents here that we published on our website that explain a little bit more our thinking here and go into detail on the specific guardrails that are important. Beyond this thinking, we have the leverage on contracts helping us to put really, really specific requirements in the contracts that suppliers have to fulfill in order to meet their requirements and then ultimately get paid and have their path toward verification. So there's a lot of them, a few that are worth calling out specifically for ocean alkalinity enhancement, rigorous MRV, which obviously we're here to talk about, These are things that are super important and like top of mind for any of these projects. Minimizing harmful ecosystem impacts is obviously also something that's top of mind for almost anyone here. And there are a lot of like very specific things that we put in place in order to monitor for that, and then have requirements for the suppliers and the ongoing projects that we support. So something like a stop trigger plan where direct measurements of like ecosystem thresholds would like halt any operations if any thresholds ever would get reached. And then community support is also something really important. You know, this is probably not the right session, or like I'm not going deep into it, but it's a very, very big part of it. And at Frontier, we think very, very much about that. And specifically for mCDR approaches, there seems to be a very high role and potential for friction, but then also we think potential opportunity here, because some of these approaches, such as ocean alkalinity enhancement, could have like co-benefits, which can help, you know, support some communities that are specifically affected from climate change, ocean acidification, and things like that. And then lastly, one thing that's really important for us is transparent data sharing, and that's something that I think you'll also hear more about in like other sessions, but that's something too that really comes from the core that I mentioned before, that we want to drive forward with these purchases, the building of a robust market, right? And with that, it's really important that from any project that we support, data is publicly available, and the scientific community, as well as just like the general public, has like access to these data, building trust, like really understanding what we're doing, why we're doing this, and then can help also in an iterative process to, you know, make the entire thing better eventually. So let's jump into MRV. Verifiability obviously is like a big part of our, you know, core criteria. You know, we pay for carbon credits. We live in a world, you know, unfortunately, that isn't pay for practice. I mean, I don't know if we're ready for that yet, but carbon accounting is like, of course, bread and butter and like really important. I want to say that in these, what we call open system pathways, you know, directly dealing with like open environments where it's inherently hard to measure, the approach that we're taking is that of uncertainty discounting, right? So it's okay if there's like some uncertainty, as long as we know what that is and can, to a high level of certainty, quantify how big that uncertainty is, right? So we, in the process that we are going through when diligencing and signing up projects, we have like multiple ways, importantly, where this is regarded, right? So during application and project diligence with specific deployments, we require companies to have like a draft protocol and verification plan. At this point, we mostly like, you know, look at the uncertainties. We have like scientific and technical experts and reviewers that help us assess the most conservative way of uncertainty discounting. And then importantly, for the point of like delivery or like, you know, offtake, payout, basically, prior to that, like all companies need to meet a set of conditions which are set in our contract, and those require us to review and approve like the project development plan, the methodology, the verifier, like everything involved here. So there's a lot of like back and forth going on the specific conditions. And then outside of like the contracting and the supplier diligence, we also have like strong partnerships with the academic field, you know, including Seaworthy, for example, or Carbon Plan, or like there's a bunch of players in the field that we support in order to, you know, help drive forward the North Standard of like towards better registry protocols and data sharing tools and all the above. Okay, again, this is, I probably need to speed up 1 second. This is, again, just showing up really that there's a lot of like nitty-gritty detail going into these protocol evaluations and verifier evaluations. So oftentimes we get asked questions like, do you even account for like the upstream emissions of the feedstock that's being used and put into the water? And what about a baseline and counterfactual? There's like all these like really important bits and pieces that are being regarded. And then again, at this point, like Frontier pays higher prices for carbon removal offtake. So we're really not trying to incentivize a race to the bottom. The cost of any carbon removal technology for us is really important on having line of sight that it can have cheap cost at large scale, because ultimately that's very important because we need a lot of carbon removal to happen. So we can't afford to have this like to be $500 a ton. However, today we are comfortable paying these like extra prices to pay for redundant measurements, to take like very conservative uncertainty discounts, and pay for additional studies that like test for ecosystem safety and all these kinds of things. So again, what does this look like? I just wanted to highlight the last offtake that we did with like Planetary on ocean alkalinity enhancement. We have a first protocol that went through all of this deep diligence, got approved by us. We think there are conservative assumptions in there. Ying will talk a lot more about this. Is the protocol perfect? Probably not, but it's a perfect starting point. And we think that with like upcoming field trials and first deliveries and these projects that are going on, we can address some of the questions. I think Matt had a good point in his previous presentation that there's an inherent challenge with MRV goals that are, we want to measure a signal and then keeping deployments like very, very small in research trials that probably like, can't achieve like a measurable signal. So here's hopefully something coming up that will help here. And then again, this is an iterative process. So for the offtake with Planetary that we just signed, there is basically a circle going on where we will have and review like all the data that's going on from a small scale deployment. This is still not exactly a huge operation. It's like an extension of a pilot program in Halifax that has been running and ongoing for a very long time. So there's a lot of precedent, data, community support, and all kinds of proof points that we that got us comfortable to increase operation at this location. Basically, there will be data sharing, as I said, in a collaboration with Carbon2C, which similar to what Cascade is doing for enhanced rock weathering. There's a repository where the supplier will make all data public, and then there's like an iterative process to go through and increase the locations. And then I just want to add with like a quick summary on where we're at, what's coming next, and then what should the research community focus on, or that's what's immediately needed. So I think it's really good progress overall in the field. There's a growing evidence base, and which I think should strengthen the confidence and efficacy and best practices. So soon we will learn a lot more on like there's a bunch of field trials underway across the globe. There are some commercial projects open that will have the data sharing requirements. So there should be a lot more data coming online that will tell us about efficacy and the best ways of MRV. And then importantly, I didn't talk much about it, but the ecosystem impacts and potential co-benefits are also something that's really important. And we are involved in a bunch of research studies to get more proof points here. So I think immediately, like R&D needs for the field and to drive forward, I think are around like technically just like access to fast dissolving safe alkalinity sources. I think we need a lot more clarity on key thresholds for key parameters. What aragonite saturation states and alkalinity levels under like certain conditions in specific areas and ocean chemistries are important and relevant. And then proof points also for ecosystem and the co-benefits, I think would be really important. And then very specifically for MRV, the tracking and near field mixing, especially subduction models, I think we need a lot more. There's a need for high resolution models, just in a lot more geographies, more intermodal comparison. We heard more about that earlier already. High sensitivity sensors and advanced dissolution models for feedstock that is added before it's completely dissolved, which is also a big research need. With that, I want to end. Thank you all, and happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. And you can put your questions in the Slido, and feel free to answer them in the Slido as well. We are going to run out of time, I think. This has just been so much information and really great information, so thank you. And next we have Ying from Isometric. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, let me share screen. Is that showing up?
Perfect.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to the Standing Committee for inviting me here today. I'm Jing He. I've spent the past few years working to bring scientific rigor and trust to marine CDR in the commercial sector, primarily by developing protocols and supporting third-party verification through my work at Isometric, which is a new type of carbon removal registry. And I'm excited to share a little bit about the current state of MRV protocols today, which will be the focus of my talk. But first, just in case anyone is not familiar, I want to define what is a registry and what's their role. So a registry is a public ledger that tracks credit issuances, ownership, and retirement. These public ledgers are important for making sure that there's no double counting of credits and to provide transparency into who's buying carbon removal and who's retiring these credits for their corporate sustainability goals. One credit represents 1 metric ton of CO2 that has been removed and verified. What does it mean for a credit to be verified? That just means that a project has gone through the full MRV process. And this is a friendly reminder that MRV is 3 different steps, and there's no single person or organization can do MRV by themselves, because the verification step, by definition, requires an independent third party to come in, assess all the data and evidence and justifications, and make sure that the project actually represents real additional carbon removal following an MRV protocol. And MRV protocols are the rule book that outlines all the requirements for how carbon removal is quantified for a particular pathway, such as OAE. The protocols also outline what types of data and evidence needs to be submitted, and the process for independent third-party auditing. We currently have 5 marine protocols that you can find. These are publicly available on the Isometric registry. We started by focusing our efforts on abiotic technology, such as electrochemical or alkalinity enhancement approaches. And our protocols are developed in an iterative process that involves multiple rounds of reviews and feedback from different stakeholders, independent subject matter experts, as well as the public. So now I want to dive into a bit more about what is in these protocols. And I want to start with environmental and social safeguards, because this is the most important thing, and safety is a prerequisite for any carbon removal credits. So in the protocol, we focus on having a proactive approach to environmental and social safeguards. And this means projects do as much diligence as possible during the planning phase before anything hits the water. So all protocols require projects to have an ongoing stakeholder input process following the principles of free, prior, and informed consent. Projects also must have official permitting and demonstrate ongoing compliance with those permits. So any measurements that are taken for permit compliance also need to be reported and verified as well, and no credits can be issued if it was discovered that permit thresholds were exceeded. And then marine projects are also required to develop a tailored adaptive management plan for pausing or adjusting their activities if certain safety thresholds or triggers are exceeded. Moving on now to quantification. So at a high level, all of our protocols have this same net CDR equation. This is across marine and terrestrial CDR pathways. I think my headphones just died. One second. Hopefully you can still hear me.
We can.
Okay, great. Using my laptop speaker. So this is the same high-level net CDR equation that all of our protocols have. So the net CO2 removed that's credited is given by the amount of CO2 that was removed and durably stored as a result of the project. And then we subtract out how much CO2 would have been removed and durably stored in the counterfactual scenario. So this gives us the additionality. And then lastly, you subtract out all the emissions associated with the project, and this is to ensure net negativity. And for the rest of the presentation, I will focus on our OAE from Coastal Outfalls Protocol as an example. In OAE, the removal occurs through the additional air-sea gas exchange relative to the ocean background. So we can combine the CO2 stored in counterfactual terms into this single delta air-sea flux term. And next, I just want to talk a little bit about how these two terms are quantified in the protocol. So starting with the air-sea flux term, the protocol outlines 3 steps that must be followed to quantify this term, and these steps are designed to bridge the wide range of spatial and temporal scales that are relevant for an OAE from Coastal Outfalls project. So step 1 requires continuous measurements out the outfall to quantify the alkalinity dosing rate and also measurements for permit compliance. And then step 2 requires characterizing the initial turbulent mixing and dilution of your alkaline plume and upscaling that perturbation into a 3D alkalinity forcing to apply to ocean models. This step also requires quantifying any alkalinity losses due to processes like secondary precipitation or biotic calcification. And then lastly, the larger scale mixing and advection of your perturbation and removal through air-sea gas exchange is quantified using 3D physical biogeochemical ocean models. This is a very high-level overview, but the protocol goes into more details on requirements for measurements and also requirements for models. Moving on to project emissions. So all the protocols have standardized requirements for quantifying emissions, and these align with best practices from ISO standards. So for example, for an OAE project, some of the emissions that must be accounted for in the system boundary include emissions related to your feedstock, production and transportation, emissions for operating your site, such as energy usage for dosing, any monitoring activities or surveys, personnel, transportation, and accommodation, and then your emissions for establishing your project site, as well as the expected emissions with closing your project site. And one final thing that I want to touch on is uncertainty quantification. So the last thing we want to do is overcredit. It doesn't help the planet if projects are inflating their climate impacts. And this is why a core pillar of our MRV protocols is acknowledging sources of uncertainty and being conservative in the quantification approach. So these are the actual sources of uncertainty for Planetary's OAE credits from earlier this year. As Frauke talked about, this is the first and only OAE project that has gone through the full MRV process so far. So they quantified all of these different sources of uncertainty, and that was propagated into an overall uncertainty value for the net carbon removal quantification. So for Planetary's project, for this particular removal period, they had a total gross of 881 additional tons of CO2 removed from the atmosphere. And then the mean emissions associated with that was 151 tons. And then the propagated uncertainty, which represents one standard deviation, is 105 tons. So in the end, the conservative number of credits that were issued was 625 tons. So that was a really quick overview into the current state of what marine CDR protocols look like today. As all of the previous speakers mentioned, as technology and science evolves over time, the protocols will also need to be regularly updated so they can continue to represent the best available science. And we imagine that over time, the protocols will stabilize and become standardized across different registries and maybe even eventually regulated by governments. And our goal at Isometric today is to take that first step and to set a really high bar for quality to lift up the standards for the field. And this is because we think it's really important for building trust and avoiding greenwashing and the pitfalls we've seen before in other carbon offsets projects. So we look forward to continually sharing learnings with the community to help scale promising technologies. And just to summarize, there's been a lot of advancements in protocol development since the first NACEB report. These protocols really lay the foundation for transparent data reporting and verification and set a high bar for scientific rigor. Another thing I find particularly exciting is that these protocols help put marine CDR on a level playing field with terrestrial CDR approaches. So this is because they use standardized emissions accounting rules, so then we can really start to compare the emissions intensity and efficiency across different CDR approaches. And then the last point is just a reminder, these current protocols are, just version 1 right now. So they're the first step and will definitely continue to evolve based on new research. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you. This really gave us a great foundation for what's going on right now and where things are going. We really appreciate this. I know our committee is going to have some more questions that we may not have time for. I put in the chat that we could go until about 2:20, which is kind of now. But I see a question from Lisa. If you guys don't mind staying on for a couple minutes, I don't mind taking a shorter break myself, but if anybody needs to jump off, please do, it's fine. But we do have to start back up with the other session at 2:30. Okay, so we have Lisa and then Jessica and Kristen. Lisa.
Okay, thank you. My question was for Frauke about just explaining what is meant, please, by the term safety. I saw it appear in the protocols, and I wondered whether this referred to mainly compliance with water quality standards or whether there's some indicator taxa or thresholds or some kind of environmental certification process involved?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it depends a little bit, or there are multiple levels of safety or across the different deployments, or what exactly is meant, right? But overall there is a let's just talk about the OAE offtake we did with Planetary, right? That deal and what's required there. There are ecosystem safety thresholds based on water quality that are just regulated by the by the regulator for the permit of that deployment, right? Which tells you, safe limits for pH and so on. So then the question is, when we do protocol review, we question if we think these thresholds are conservative and safe enough, or what can be done on top of the already existing requirements for safety. What else can we layer on top, right? And then there's, for example, additional studies to be done on getting clearer information on ecosystem thresholds. But I think right now, there is aragonite saturation, there is pH, there are like TSS levels. So it's all like water chemistry based, and as well as like metal toxicity, like impurities and so on. So there's a monitoring for a bright sweep or for a broader sweep of parameters. And then we rely on existing ecosystem impact frameworks to tell like safe limits for these parameters. Does that answer your question, Lisa?
Thank you.
Thank you. Jessica?
Thanks, Kelly. So my question is getting down a little bit into the nuts and bolts of how MRV works, and specifically, this idea that, as any carbon chemist can tell you,
It's imperative that everyone stays to 5 minutes or we'll never get through. And then it's really just meant to, spark additional questions and inquiry. So, this is a very starter high level overview. We understand you can't get through a whole lot in 5 minutes. Okay, so let's start with, okay, so our first speaker is here. Gaurav, are you ready to go?
Hey, Kelly, how's it going? Yes, I'm ready to go.
Okay, all right. 5 minutes.
Okay,
Thanks,
I don't know
Gaurav.
if I can click my own slides, but I guess I can say next slide.
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Gaurav Sant. I'm a professor of engineering at UCLA. I'm also the CTO of a company called Aquatic, which I'm going to tell you about. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk to you about Aquatic, which was built as a seawater electrolysis platform that couples carbon dioxide removal with the production of green hydrogen. Next slide, please. So the general approach behind the process is really quite straightforward. The way I want you to think about it, going from the left-hand side to the right-hand side of the screen, you start with seawater that contains calcium and magnesium and sodium chloride and dissolved inorganic carbon. You bring it into an electrolyzer where you let two things happen. The first is at the cathode, you produce alkalinity. At the anode, you produce acidity. You use the alkalinity to convert calcium and dissolved inorganic carbon that's present in seawater into calcium carbonate and into magnesium hydroxide. At the anode, you only produce oxygen. You don't produce chlorine because the approach that we've developed involves the use of what's known as oxygen selective anodes, which allow us to suppress the production of chlorine. And of course, as you might imagine, as a function of the hydrogen evolution reaction, we produce hydrogen at the cathode. I should point out that the way that the approach is built, we use either rock or some sort of an alkaline solute to quench the acidity that we produce at the anode. The process has a gross energy intensity of about 2.3 megawatt hours per ton of carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere and fully stabilized in the form of calcium carbonate and magnesium bicarbonate, which I will talk about in a second. If you consider the energy that's associated with the hydrogen that you produce, that gives you a net energy intensity of about 1 to 1.5 megawatt hours per ton of CO2. Next slide, please. So the way I want to try and build a thesis around this is really, again, to use a block flow diagram. All the way to the left, you've got seawater that contains dissolved inorganic carbon, calcium, and magnesium. When we bring it into the electrolyzer, we end up producing calcium carbonate by combining DIC with calcium to the stoichiometric limit. And this is really a function of being a inorganic carbon limited system. So you actually have calcium still present as cations. You end up producing magnesium hydroxide to the full stoichiometric limit. So you convert all of the 55 millimoles of magnesium into magnesium hydroxide. Going on to what happens next, we take the solution, which is now alkaline. We add CO2 to it from the atmosphere. With the idea being that we're using the CO2 essentially as an acidic gas to dissolve the magnesium hydroxide and convert into magnesium bicarbonate. As you add CO2 to that system, the calcium that you have left over that is still cationic converts into calcium carbonate. So you end up with a process that gives you about 4.6 grams of CO2 removal from the atmosphere per kilogram of seawater that you process. Important to point out that you're doing stabilization by producing calcium carbonate and magnesium bicarbonate, which is the means by which the natural system, so to speak, absorbs CO2 as well. Next slide, please. So we've been working on this for quite a while. It's been about 5 years now. Where we are is we are currently in the midst of building a demonstration plant in Singapore that will actually go online in the next couple of months. That plant will do about 4,000 tons of carbon removal per year. That's a rendering of what the plant looks like, but I want you to imagine it's effectively a bunch of electrolyzers that are organized together. Next slide, please. I should also mention, in addition to this demonstration plant, we are in what's known as FEL2, front-end loading, stage 2 engineering for a larger commercial facility, which we think of sort of as a reference plant because it can be built in a variety of different locations. It's essentially designed to be site agnostic, although there are a particular set of sites that we're spending much more time with than others. Next slide, please. I think given as I'm coming up to my 5-minute mark, I should just point out, one of the things that we've been really focused on is really making sure that we've got a robust measurement reporting and verification platform that surrounds all of this. And while I'm happy to take questions, I should maybe just say the way the process is built, we can close the mass balance around carbon removal perfectly well, looking at either the liquid phase, the solid phase, and the gas phase, and by combining all of them together. So you can essentially establish the total amount of carbon removal as a function of the CO2 that's in the dissolved phase and changes thereof, in the solids and changes thereof, and including potential concepts related to evasion that you might get from seawater if you don't have your discharge designed correctly. With that said, happy to conclude and take questions when the time is right.
Thanks so much, Gaurav. Ken Bissler is next.
Thank you, and I hope you can hear me. Basically, my story starts with John Martin and young scientists at Woods Hole sitting on the floor of a packed room listening and say this quote, "Give me half a tank of iron, I'll give you the next ice age." Obviously, he wasn't testing marine CDR, but he was considering the role of iron in controlling ocean productivity and photosynthesis. Fast forward 35 years, I was one of the authors on the Academy's ocean-based carbon dioxide removal report. Next slide. I realized today that there is a lot of focus on ocean alkalinity. So just to remind you, why would you consider adding iron to the ocean for mCDR? Well, it certainly has scaling potential. There are, in just the high nutrient areas, enough excess nutrients to move on order of gigatons of carbon dioxide per year. There's also possibility of removing CO2 from stimulating nitrogen fixation in low nutrient areas. The unique thing about it, the second bullet, is it doesn't take very much iron. It's an essential nutrient, but you don't need very much. A little iron goes a long way. So unlike many of these other techniques, 1 part iron can give you 1,000 parts, say, of carbon growth and removal. That's not even what nature does. It's more like 1 to 100,000. Because of that, because we're using sunlight, because we're not putting factories in the ocean, the cost will be low by most any metric. And back in the 1990s and early 2000s, we did several field experiments. They were relatively short term. They did produce export. I think there's some confusion about that. It was measured relatively shallow. We were not there long enough to see the full additionality and durability, but it was on the order of several thousand tons of removed, and that was shown back in the 90s. Next slide. But there is more to it, particularly if you go to scale, right? We need information if we wanted to move forward with CDR of what might be impacts downstream from using nutrients elsewhere. Right now, we have to rely on models. Those models are pretty incomplete in terms of the biological carbon pump. A recent one showed a 5% decrease in biomass, long way away from the Southern Ocean where those nutrients were removed, but that was accompanied by 200 gigatons of CO2 removal. So we have to think of both. It will change the ocean. What are those impacts? Right now, we have models that are imperfect, particularly the further out in time you go. Oxygen is consumed as that carbon sinks to the biological carbon pump. Those decreases are relatively small. Actually, I'll be talking about that later today in a call in this forum I'll mention to you soon. The type of diatoms that grow in response to iron include the Pseudodicea species. They can produce domoic acid, a HAB toxin that was not observed in those iron experiments. And we did look for things like nitrous oxide and methane that can be produced from decomposing carbon organic matter. Those were small impacts, even though they're more potent greenhouse gases, they did not offset. It was a couple of % offset for the CO2. Next slide. So then I want to introduce what's happened since 2022. That report, this kind of bottom-up group formed. We're now over 60 members, 9 countries, 37 institutions. We are particularly interested in studying ocean iron fertilization. We're not saying we're ready to deploy, but we want to answer those questions. We're a non-for-profit house at Hui, but we represent many institutions, and we're looking for public and private partnerships to make that happen. Next slide. One of the first things we did in 2022, Kila Patti Ramakrishna, Margaret Lyon, and myself, we put together a code of conduct. How would we guide those studies? You can see the points here about we're doing this for the benefit of humans, the environment. We are not seeking credits. We did not form a business to do that. Next slide. We meet every month, including later today. We've met in person to come up with 5 main types of activities, from field studies to models, to looking at the type of iron you might put in, to looking at EMRV and MRV and the social and governance issues. We published those, for example, in that article in Frontiers. And then my last slide, because I know we have to be quick here today. I just want to point out that there's more that's going on. There are modeling comparisons happening through NOAA NOP support. This is largely Dennis McGillicuddy and colleagues, and through our funding through Ocean Visions. We do have activities supported by ARPA-E, that's both models and technology improvements. We had a field planning workshop. We want to get in the field, possibly by 2027, 2028. We would do that under permits through the London Protocol Convention. We're involving communities and, of course, MRV, EMRV. The 4th bullet, we have brought in a group led by Liliana Bastian, Sarah Navas, Romney Webb, to help us think about the governance, community engagement, social scientist needs, and we tend to show up at these national, international events to talk about what we're doing and be open about our plans. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ken. Next up is Kristen Davis. Welcome, Kristen.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay? Great. Okay. So, awesome. So I want to thank the committee for their work on this. Today, I'm just going to review our current understanding or current since the last report, some things that have been going on to think about seaweed cultivation as a strategy for carbon dioxide removal. And first, I think it's useful to review our current understanding for the pathways for carbon sequestration for farmed seaweed that's intentionally sunk for carbon sequestration. And I'm going to use this figure I'm borrowing here from Dave Siegel because I think it's really useful. Essentially, it shows as a percentage of total seaweed net primary production on a farm, we expect that about 20% of that biomass is lost in the upper ocean due to growth, harvest, during preparation for conveyance. And then while 15% of the fixed carbon is lost to dissolved organic carbon compounds that are released during growth, either as exudation or as seaweed tissue is breaking down with age or senescence. So assuming that the seaweed is harvested and somehow conveyed quickly down to great depths, this leaves about 65% of the biomass transported to depth. So there's assumption that about 1/3 of the DOC pool is harder to break down and therefore effectively sequestered. So taking this, you can't see my gestures on the slide, but essentially that left arrow DOC lost, about 1/3 of that, which is the 5%, is sequestered. So it's estimated that we can sequester a total of about 70% of the carbon from cultivated seaweed, but there are a huge number of uncertainties in this hypothetical that we'll talk about a little. So next slide. So what do we know? On the next slide. Great, thanks. So what do we know? Well, the reason we were interested in seaweed as a potential strategy to begin with is that it grows very quickly, faster than terrestrial plants. It also has a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, so higher than redfield, which is advantageous for carbon sequestration, as seaweeds can store more carbon per unit nitrogen or fix more carbon per unit nitrogen. And both stoichiometric and dynamic models suggest that it's possible to produce climate relevant scales of seaweed carbon. So greater than a gigaton a year in the global ocean, even if we just look at exclusive economic zones, so near shore or nearer to shore areas. But certainly it can be cost prohibitive in some locations, and it takes a huge area of the ocean. So for example, some dynamic models suggest that we can harvest greater than a gigaton of seaweed carbon, but it takes over 1 million square kilometers of the most productive regions of the world's EEZs. So this really presents a scaling challenge. We are nowhere near that. And it's challenging to scale up quickly an industry like this. So, the next slide, please. All right, so we are building modeling tools to help us to understand where it might make sense to cultivate seaweed for sinking or potentially for growing it for other end-use products that could help offset greenhouse gas emissions. And some of this work shows that there may be other uses for cultivated seaweed biomass that make more economic sense than sinking it. For example, in replacing liquid biofuels for transportation, which is a notoriously hard to decarbonize energy sector. All right, next slide. But these models need a lot of improvement. We still really need to understand better the permanence of this seaweed biomass in different, this seaweed carbon in different pathways. How long does this seaweed carbon store, biomass store carbon when sunk to the bottom of the ocean? What is the fate of the seaweed-derived DOC compounds? How many of them are recalcitrant? How long do they last? And then certainly an important part of this are the environmental feedbacks. How does the cultivation of seaweed alter upper ocean nutrients? How does it shade phytoplankton productivity? And what are the feedbacks on the biological pump? And then in the deep ocean, certainly how would sinking biomass change benthic ecosystems and biogeochemical cycling? Both the permanence and the environmental feedbacks, as well as the MRV, the last point, these really require field trials. We need to be able to really measure the environmental feedbacks and the breakdown of this material under controlled situations, but at a scale that's relevant for answering these questions. And so those field trials, and you can flip to the next slide, I think have come, many of them have started since the report came out in 2022. This is an example, some pictures of one that we just got back from the field less than 2 weeks ago from the Faroe Islands, working with ocean rainforests, growing sugar kelp, and really setting up some of those inside-outside farm measurements, really trying to understand carbon cycling associated with these farms. So I think many more of these are needed to begin to get at some of the questions. And the last slide is a couple of references that I put there just for later for the committee. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kristen. Thank you. Next, we will have Peter Raymond to discuss blue carbon OE.
Hey everybody. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about ocean alkalinity from blue carbon ecosystems. Bunch of work we're doing here at Yale. Next slide. So the geochemistry from this, I think, is known to most in this group, but blue carbon ecosystems sort of naturally produce bicarbonate through multiple mechanisms. One of them sulfate reduction, but another mechanism is when these systems have a lot of calcium carbonate in their sediments, which is not uncommon. alkalinity can be production can be quite high through the dissolution of this calcium carbonate. So this is the production of ocean alkalinity. Next slide. We've done some modeling and empirical work. Moji Fakhri here wrote a paper with NOAA that you can look up, where he modeled the alkalinity production in mangroves that don't have calcium carbonate in their sediments, and those that do, you get alkalinity production in both, but you get quite a bit when these mangroves sit on calcium carbonate. Next slide. You can keep going. Yeah, and so yeah, we have a bunch of sites where we're sort of doing empirical measurements. This is some recent results from the Everglades, where if you can see that blue down arrow, that's the amount of organic carbon burial in this system from other studies, and we're constraining all the other carbon fluxes and the alkalinity production depending on the estuary that you're looking at. It's that T-alk number. Depending on the estuary that you're looking at or the season that you're at in there is, in this system, yeah, about equal to organic carbon burial. So these systems can pump out quite a bit of alkalinity. This is in mangrove that sits on calcium carbonate. Next slide. And so what we're doing here is we're trying to quantify the carbon and the economics of this, and sort of see if this can be a mechanism and work in this as a mechanism for facilitating mangrove restoration. So see if we can come up with a long-term funding mechanism for mangrove restoration. Next slide. Currently, we are in conversation with a bunch of restoration partners. So we're actively looking for partners for an ideal test site. Obviously, we were looking for sites that are undergoing restoration, where we don't have to, where Yale, does not have to lead the restoration, where this is already occurring. We are targeting sites that have this calcium carbonate substrate and that has a partnership that we can work with, not only through them leading the restoration, but on some of the MRV. And if you'll show the next slide. And so the MRV is something that Yale will lead. As I said, we've been doing this at multiple sites and sort of like working up established methods and trying to work up new models and improve old models for sort of near field and far field modeling dynamics and 1D sedimentary models. The field modeling, we're trying to keep to simple methods that we can work with partners to sort of take the lead in the MRV, but also provide some training so that our local restoration partners can play a role in the field monitoring. Next slide. So we're in phase 1. We have seed funding for this from the Builders Initiative. And we've done a hire this summer, Gabby, to help with the development. And so right now we're engaging with multiple restoration projects and seeing if we can find 1 or 2 ideal sites. I think importantly, we're also developing a partnership with a registry to try to work out commercial protocol development by which these restoration projects could perhaps earn some revenue. And while we're doing this, we're securing the capital for phase 2 and 3. And the next phases include developing a field campaign. So working at a couple pilot sites. Next slide. And, refining our modeling, continuing to work with the protocol development, and advancing relationships with buyers, which would be the final stage, where we try to go through what we're calling research to deployment, where we partner with a buyer, the registry, and restoration projects to try to produce revenue from mangrove restoration. Last slide, I think. So there's a couple names. You can email any of us if you have any questions or interest or want to get involved. And thanks for the platform and the time here.
Thank you so much. And moving right on, we have Jess Adkins with South Korea.
Hi, everybody. Really appreciate the chance to speak to you. I just want to make sure you can actually hear me while my lips are moving. Is that all okay?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So, yep, I am CEO and co-founder of Calcaria. I'm on leave from this other job I have as a professor at Caltech. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about what we're up to about trying to decarbonizing shipping by using the accelerated weathering of limestone. And so here's a ship that has a schematic of one of our reactors on board. It is that reactor is running the reaction that you see down below. It's CO2 from the exhaust gas is being combined with limestone. I'm going to show you some actual reactors in a minute with limestone packed beds to produce salty water, calcium ions and bicarbonate. If you click, I think we get some other bullet points here. If you could just advance, thank you. So why are we doing this on ships? They're really a beautiful coupling for the accelerated weathering of limestone. They are little floating power plants. And so this is carbon capture and storage. This is not CDR. I want to be super clear about this, right? We are trying to mitigate the emissions of a current load to the atmosphere in a hard to decarbonize sector of the economy. And there are two reasons that we can be inexpensive in how we do this. The first is that because we don't make an intermediate carbon product in that CCS value chain, we just immediately convert the CO2 to bicarbonate. We don't purify or concentrate or refrigerate or pressurize a carbon product that has to get pumped underground. And the second part is that the ship's forward motion is a giant water pump. And so we get a real advantage there in how much water you need to move to do AWL. So if we click to the next one. We have been working at this for well over 10 years now. That first bullet down there on the left, 2011, the first dissolution rate PhD thesis starts. That was Adam Subhash's PhD thesis is being referred to there. I'll show you the end line here of some of the reactors that we built. But one thing I want to emphasize is that one of the really great things that came out of Adam's thesis was the discovery of a catalyst for the dissolution of calcium carbonate. Calcaria is not using that catalyst. That we get confused by that sometimes. I'm sure that's my own messaging problem, but we've abandoned the use of the catalyst for some really good science that got done. That was like a solar plexus shot to the engineering. So I'll show you these reactors now. If we click to the next one. We started out in the lab at small scale. This is work that just came out this year from Sichadong et al. So early mixed bed reactors and gas absorbers. We click to the next slide. Data from that reactor is shown here as over the course of a few hours. The data are the X's, and then the key here is all the lines that I'm going to show you are our model, because we've worked out the dissolution kinetics in the lab very well for the last decade. We can build first principle models of our system that don't require scale-up factors in order to do it. You can see the data model comparison is working out well. This is published now in Science Advances just a few months ago. Next slide. And so we built a larger scale versions of those. On the left is a fluidized bed reactor. On the right is a packed column reactor. We initially in the fluidized bed had the gas, the water, and the solid all in a bubbling cauldron there together. We've actually separated the gas absorption step and the solid dissolution steps in what's labeled Ripple 3 there. If we click to the next slide. You can see that that's helped us a lot. So here is data in the PCO2 before and after as a function of time. Ripple 1, the fluidized bed reactor on the left there, and Ripple 3, the split gas absorber and solid dissolver. We've gone from 30% of the CO2 absorbed to close to 50% of the CO2 absorbed and coming to a nice steady state. If we click to the next slide. Of course, the key issue, though, is how much of that CO2 that's gone into the water has actually been neutralized by limestone. And so here you can see data from Ripple 3 and an AlkEIC plot. If you start in the lower left, that's where the seawater that we fed in came from. This is about 5% CO2 stream. So that in the gas absorber increased the DIC in those first dots you see moving to the right with no alkalinity addition. And then the red arrow is a 2-to-1 line pointing up to the final effluent coming out, where now we've neutralized a lot of that CO2 by reacting it with limestone. And so that here about 2/3 of the CO2 that went into the water was actually neutralized by the limestone. This gives us about 480 kilowatt hours per ton of CO2, or about $99 per ton when we scale up to the large levels of a ship. So next slide. We've been working a lot, and this is work from Will Burleson's graduate student Ruchawani working out of Catalina to do control and ad experiments with monitoring the local community off of Catalina, just to see the first stages of, is there an ecological impact to what we're up to? It's PCO2, POC, and PIC, the three plots you see here, and there's no difference between the control and the additions of calcarea effluent. And last slide here. We think that in the future, you could build ships, that purpose-built ships that just react CO2 in limestone to store that CO2 in the ocean as bicarbonate. And so doing more than just decarbonizing shipping, which is a gigaton a year of CO2, right? It's a fair bit to try to do. This is competing with storing CO2 underground, and it frees the carbon storage part from the fossil fuel industry and brings it back to a second way that we might be able to store CO2 at scale. Last slide is just my email. I'll be happy to take any questions at any point. Thanks very much for the time.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Next, we have Steve Romaniello with Vesta. Thanks for joining us.
Hey everyone, just checking that you can hear me okay?
Perfect.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to be representing Vesta today. Next slide, please. Next slide, thanks. I just want to tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm a marine biogeochemist, isotope geochemist with, before joining Vesta full-time, I was a professor at University of Tennessee, Knoxville. I've been with Vesta now for about 4 years. I switched to Vesta full-time during the pandemic. And at Vesta, I'm responsible for our scientific direction in R&D stuff. Next slide, please. Vesta was actually mentioned in the first 2022 report from National Academies. We're really grateful for that. And we were mentioned specifically for our work developing pilot projects. And so what have we been up to since 2022? Well, we've done 3 different pilot projects. One in Southampton, New York. That was a beach project with about 600 tons of olivine. We did a project in Heron River, Massachusetts. That was a salt marsh station project with about 1 ton of olivine. And we did a project in North Carolina, our latest project that I'll talk about more in this presentation, with about 8,000 tons of olivine. That duck project was really significant. That was the first federally permitted standalone OAE field trial in the US. We've been busy doing lots of other things too. So we've conducted more than a dozen ecotoxicology experiments since 2022. And that's on top of the dozen or so experiments we had done before. We've published 5 papers in the last 3 years with results for about 10 more papers that are in prep. We've raised and invested more than $20 million into marine OAE research and development. We've established a new innovative model. We're working with our partners, Hourglass Climate. They're a nonprofit that provides objective independent monitoring and evaluation of our field pilots. And finally, what you guys would normally think of as broader impacts, we've worked with at least 22 different academic organizations, NGOs, federal agencies, and commercial partners. Next slide, please. So I want to talk to you a little bit about our duck field project. This is our latest pilot, our largest pilot to date. This project was deployed in May to June of 2024. There's about 8,300 metric tons of olivine. It was deployed about 500 meters offshore in 7 meters of water as a nearshore berm. We were interested in that berm deployment model because it's very efficient. It was also a result of our permitting process. We spent about 3 years in permitting, working with local partners to identify optimal project design. And that project helped us avoid potential impacts on things like sea turtles. We're collaborating with the Army Corps of Engineers, Hourglass Climate, Coastal Studies Institute on this project. And just for scale, and so everyone understands sort of what these pilot projects cost, this is about a $12 million effort, and about $7 million of that goes into MRV and EMRV. Next slide, please. So probably the most important part of this, the thing that might be of most interest to many of you, is the monitoring plan. So we've got 2 years of independent monitoring with this program. one of the things that Vesta was really set up to do was to figure out, hey, can you actually do this? Can you monitor the geochemical effects? Can you monitor the ecological effects of a project like this? A lot of people thought this might be impossible, and as Grace alluded to as well, we think we're making a lot of progress here. I can't go through all the details in this table, but the major monitoring categories that we look at include water quality, ecology, sediment transport. We're also using things like side-scan sonar and protected species observers to look at impacts during placement. We monitor all the geochemistry things that you think of, water quality, pore water geochemistry, things like that. We have annual reporting requirements as part of our permits to state and federal agencies. We've got multiple independent monitoring collaborators that help us with all of this. We help to ensure that they bring a degree of rigor and independence to the project. And this whole monitoring plan is available publicly, so please email me if you'd like a copy. Next slide, please. Our ecological monitoring plan is based on a Baki design. We use that actually for monitoring geochemical, sedimentological, and ecological parameters. So we've got a control site, we've got a treatment site, we've got measurements before and after treatment. So I think in the for sake of time here, let's go next slide, please. So I wanted to show you some of the results from this project. These are data that was presented a little bit earlier by Hourglass. But the main questions we'd ask is it safe? Right? Yes, it's safe. So our ecology results to date show, as we expect, a low but detectable nickel concentration. There's no evidence of ecological impact. We see full species recovery in terms of abundance and diversity after 2 months here. And so you can see on this figure on the right that there is a little bit of nickel in these species, but this is about 7 ppm, something like that, which are not expected to be harmful levels. We don't see any other evidence of uptake of trace metals, and we do see potential evidence of nickel dilution, which is sort of the opposite of biomagnification, and that's what we expect to see for nickel in marine environments. The main takeaway here is that ecological safety is driven by olivine concentration, and our job is to evaluate safety thresholds and engineer deployments so that we maintain these safe levels on a site-by-site basis, not a one-size-fits-all model. Next slide. And here's some of our geochemical results. So that's another question we get asked all the time is it working? Yes, it's working. So the olivine's dissolving, and our geochemical parameters suggest that carbon removal is happening at about the rate that we had predicted in models. 3 weeks post-placement data indicated that we were precipitating, primarily removing carbon by precipitating calcium carbonate minerals. By 9 weeks post-placement, the data suggested that the primary carbon removal mechanism was probably alkalinity degeneration of release of bicarbonate to the water column. And as Grace showed, the treatment site sustained a higher pH over about 7 months now. So you can see here in this figure on the right, at a control site, we've got respiration-derived CO2 in the pore water at about 1,000 to 1,500 ppmv. And our olivine treatment site, we basically completely take up all of that respiration-derived CO2. And again, same message here. The carbon removal effectiveness will be driven by olivine concentration. That's the real technology here, is engineering these deployments on a site-by-site basis to optimize what we're interested in. So next slide, please. So my last slide. So, what's next for Vesta? We're working on getting pilot publications out from all these pilot projects and peer-reviewed journals and public reports. In the meantime, I have lots and lots of data. We're happy to share all of our results with the Academy or other people. Please reach out by email if you're interested in getting copies of that. We're working a lot on partnerships and governance. So over the next 18 to 24 months, we're going to continue our strategy of research through deployment. We're currently working on engaging with coastal construction partners, establishing an independent oversight committee to guide and govern our research efforts, so stay tuned for that. We're also working on finishing up our MRV methodology with our partners at Absolute Climate. And then lastly, I just wanted to say, we're delighted to assist the Academy however we can be helpful. We're recalling Antonius's comment from the June meeting that we're really hopeful that the Academy can help to develop standards and expectations to guide safe and responsible scaling from the lab to small-scale field pilots and eventually to initial commercial deployments. With that, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Steve. And then we have two more. We've got Noah Planovsky with Crew Carbon and with Yale. Switching over to wastewater. Welcome, Noah.
Great. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to share with you. See, I'm a professor at Yale University, but we have a long-term research collaboration with Crew Carbon. So I'm going to pivot a little bit here and talk about how we can drive long-term storage of carbon in the oceans by focusing on improvements to wastewater treatment. Next slide. So it's lots of ways you can make a case for having new carbon dioxide removal projects. You can equally make cases that we should be having projects that are improving or ways to pilot new techniques for improving how wastewater treatment plants work. One of the easiest ways to frame that is that the amount of money that folks paying for wastewater has dramatically increased relative to basically all other sectors in the US. So that's what's shown as the main figure here. We can show that as kind of the US price index, even relative to food prices, which is something we obviously think about as increasing prices that are putting a strain on average folks. Wastewater prices, your sewer taxes, your wastewater treatment taxes are something that is rapidly increasing in the US. So our basic idea is how can we try to drive wastewater treatment costs down? How can we improve wastewater treatment plant processing while also driving the co-benefit of long-term storage of carbon in the oceans? Next slide. So wastewater treatment plants, as folks are basically available, is to deal with the problem of the roughly 1 billion tons of biosolids that we produced in cities that we need to export from cities while minimizing the amount of pollution and environmental degradation that causes as much as possible. So in the US, this is done mostly through utilizing roughly $2 trillion of infrastructure to move biosolids into a series of wastewater treatment plants. In wastewater treatment plants, try to drive down the pollution as much as possible, really just trying to oxidize the organic matter as quickly as possible. That produces huge amounts of CO2, which in natural systems will move back to the atmosphere, but that also acidifies the wastewaters, which can actually inhibit this process of biological treatment of our biosolids that we're moving through. Can move to the next slide. So what we've been doing is trying to think about ways in which we can both minimize that acidification that's occurring in wastewater that can inhibit some of the biogeochemical processes that need to occur in wastewater treatment plants, and also capture some of the CO2 that is happening, some of the CO2 that is leaving that system naturally. So what we've been doing is adding alkaline minerals. Foremost right now, we are focusing on adding finely milled limestone to wastewater treatment plants in a way that, by having a closed system, allows us to both directly monitor the amount of carbon dioxide removal that is occurring, and that allows us, by having, in many cases, real-time monitoring of the system, allows us to optimize the wastewater treatment plant to ensure that we have optimize the wastewater treatment plant to, for instance, focus on how we can reduce nitrogen pollution from these plants as much as possible. We can increase the amount of biosolids that are actually removed instead of moving into coastal oceans. Okay, next slide. One of the things that makes this a particularly appealing process, one of the things that we're particularly excited about, is that in many cases, this is an example of our dosing system from the New Haven wastewater treatment plant, is it's very easy to tie into the infrastructure to have this occurring. There's no new permitting that's required from this. Alkalinity is already, your acid-base balance is something you're already managing on wastewater treatment plants. And in many cases, it's very easy to move the infrastructure that is needed for these things into wastewater treatment plants. Okay, next slide. So to jump to some actual data here to kind of close this off, this is an example of some of the data we've been collecting from a plant in Freiburg in Germany. Freiburg is an interesting case as you have multiple different trains where wastewater comes in homogenized and it moves through several separate channelized systems. So what we're comparing here in the blue line is one of these trains that does not have our alkalinity management system to our upper line here, which is where we've been dosing that system with fine-grain calcium carbonate. And what you can see from this, obviously, is there is a marked increase in the alkalinity that we're adding to that system that we can consistently measure. And importantly, instead of having something that is very variable, which leads to huge problems for the actual wastewater treatment plant, we have a constant elevated alkalinity label. And then shown in green here is just in one of these trains, we're actually seeing the amount of carbon dioxide removal that is occurring through this process of carbonate weathering in wastewater treatment plants. Next slide. Yeah, and we'll leave it there. This is something we're really excited about. I think as we're thinking about marine carbon dioxide removal, it's one of the main messages from that would have is it behooves us to also think about how we can be doing things that ties into existing infrastructure and doing things in the early stages of marine carbon dioxide removal that really benefits local communities as well. And we'll leave it there. For any questions, feel free to reach out to me or folks from Crew Carbon. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Noah. Our last one for today is Morgan Raven to talk about biomass sinking. Thanks for joining us, Morgan.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sound okay? Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the chance to be here. Again, I'm Morgan Raven. I'm at UC Santa Barbara. I also want to make sure that I'm clear. I'm also wear a second hat as the Chief Science Officer for Carboniferous, which is a startup that's working on R&D on related topics. And I want to make sure I update the committee about both aspects. So I'll try to be clear about which are which here. Next slide. So I want to talk to you about biomass sinking, or what we've started calling marine anoxic carbon storage. And essentially this CO2 removal approach takes advantage of plants, which are incredibly efficient, land-based, of course, CO2 concentrating mechanisms that we use to concentrate that CO2. And the idea is to transport that material and store it in a long-lived marine reservoir comparable to natural feedbacks in the Earth system over the Cenozoic. And so to identify a marine reservoir like this, we're thinking about something with a density interface that's going to inhibit mixing with the broader ocean, making this significantly different from a lot of techniques we've heard about today. And that density interface is also going to enable the generation of anoxia beneath it, which can lead to the efficient preservation of biomass under those conditions. And just a quick note on semantics. I recognize, as Jess mentioned for his technique, that this is not a marine CDR technology, although it exists in the ocean and it interacts with all the same processes we're talking about here. This is a hybrid land-ocean approach, but I'm really grateful for its inclusion with the Academy. Next, please. So the reason we want to talk about this, first and foremost, I'm going to give you 4 big reasons, but the number one is that photosynthesis is incredibly efficient, and therefore this is a technology that can scale fast and do so with really high carbon efficiency. So this is a recent compilation from this year comparing the carbon efficiency and energy use per ton of a lot of techniques we've seen here, including some that were talked about as scaling quickly, like BECCS and DAC. Marine biomass sinking is among the highest carbon efficiencies and the lowest energy uses per ton. And although there's wiggle room around that blue star, LCAs can readily achieve better than 90% efficiency. Next slide. Benefit number 2 is that we're relying on existing agricultural biomass and infrastructure that has been optimized by humans for hundreds of years. This material already exists, and that means there's also opportunities for co-benefits. In the United States, we've mostly been thinking about sugarcane bagasse, which is available in megaton quantities as a waste product all around the Gulf, especially in Louisiana and Florida. This is a nuisance product. It releases methane, it takes active tending, and its removal is a co-benefit for these communities. Next, please. 2 other quick benefits. Isolated anoxic basins have edges. This gives us a lot of things to work with. It facilitates monitoring because you have a fixed volume to work with. Permitting can occur within a defined jurisdiction, and it also limits the potential broader impacts into that global commons of the surrounding environments. Because it's isolated, we also get characteristics like anoxia that limit biological processes, eliminating complex ecological communities on the seafloor involving animals and macrofauna, and our bread and butter scientifically, enhancing the overall preservation of that organic matter over time. And so we're talking in this case in the US again about Orca Basin, located about a day's steam south of New Orleans. This is about a 200-meter thick anoxic brine pool on the seafloor that underlays about 2.5 kilometers of normal seawater above. Next, please. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the project we've been doing for the last couple of years, doing some initial field experiments. This was the Ocean Carbon Retention under Anoxia project. And it involved a series of cruises to the site, 4 of them, where we deployed and recovered benthic landers with various biomass materials and did a bunch of parallel lab incubations at UCSB and with some other academic partners. This is what those landers look like. There is a lot of science on here, but I just want to highlight a couple of things. The first is just a gut check. The photo on the left is a picture of macrocystis that was freeze-dried, sterilized, put in the basin, left for 200 days, and recovered. And if you did this in an anoxic site like Santa Barbara Basin, it would be half gone and the rest would be goo. In this case, we're looking at material that is pristine, turgid green, and almost the same as when it was originally deployed. Next, please. We can get more detail about the mechanisms that are underlying this exceptional preservation in brines in lab experiments. There's a lot to talk about. I would also love to share any of this data that people are interested in. But essentially what happens when we put sugarcane in anoxic seawater is that about 1% of it dissolves, makes DOM, and that depending on whether we're in brine or regular seawater, we may or may not see breakdown. So we were able to observe slow breakdown of sugarcane bagasse in anoxic normal seawater, a sequence of microbial metabolisms you would expect. But even using radio labels in lab, we were not able to detect any breakdown through metabolic processes through 200 days in the brine conditions. And so this is telling us this is potentially a hotspot for preservation worth studying further. Next, please. So I just want to give you 2 forward-looking updates. Number 1, as I said, I'm also the CSO with Carboniferous. And so growing on a lot of this initial data, Carboniferous has spent a couple years applying for an EPA MPRSA research permit that would allow the placement of 20 experimental bales of about 1 ton in size over about 18 months loaded with all the science. This would be to basically verify what we see in lab mesocosms at scale and to develop and validate the MRV tools that are needed for these environments. We are currently waiting for the EPA's word following the closure of the public comment period mid-July. Next, please. But on a global scale, I mean, this is where this particular pathway has the potential to make a really large impact. And so we've been trying to build a much larger global community around this. In February, we co-hosted a workshop in Bucharest that brought together more than 30 researchers from 15 countries to discuss potential risk pathways and concerns, to evaluate sites, and to develop criteria that we could use to evaluate potential scale. And there is an in-prep manuscript from that for submittal to Biogeosciences in the coming weeks. Next, please. So just to conclude, marine anoxic carbon storage or terrestrial biomass sinking has pretty tantalizing potential to contribute, especially to near-term, rapidly scaled CO2 removal needs in the US and globally. There are really important key unknowns out there that we need a focused research program and essentially field trials to move forward on. And I'm grateful for its inclusion in the consideration for this report. Thanks.
Everyone. Yeah, I don't see any hands raised. I will give one quick opportunity to our panelists if you have any questions for us. I see one in the chat. Yes, all the slides will be posted and the recordings will also be posted.